Jaime Lannister had always wondered what it would take to break him completely. He had endured much in his life. A father whose pride had long overshadowed his children's desires. A sister whose hold on his heart was at once carnal and unbreakable. The stares of a realm that whispered Kingslayer, Oathbreaker behind his back. He had weathered the scorn of lords and ladies, had borne the shame of a vow broken for the sake of saving 500,000 lives, only to find that the realm did not care for heroism when the story was too ugly to tell over a fire with wine. Through all of it, his capture, his severed hand, the humiliation, Jaime had watched himself adapt, survive, sometimes thrive, and yet, for all his burdens, he had rarely felt the weight of them truly suffocating his heart. Not until the moment he stood in the bowels of the Red Keep, in a passageway older than the Iron Throne itself, watching his father, Tywin Lannister, pace like a caged lion among the vaults that stored the crown's gold. He had come upon Tywin unexpectedly, late at night. The corridors were quiet and damp, the torches guttering from the breezes that found their way in through the cracks. The place reeked of old parchment, old secrets, the hush of an ancient hush. He had not meant to spy on his father, but seeing him there, his father's broad shoulders hunched slightly in thought, had set Jaime's heart to hammering. He thought of Tyrion, freed from the black cells with Jaime's reluctant assistance. He thought of the knowledge he carried that would damn Cersei if revealed, the knowledge of their twisted, entangled lives that was known in corners of the realm and rumored in all the rest. Then he thought of what his father had done, how Tywin had shaped them all, so cleverly, so coldly, as if every one of them were mere pawns on his battlefield. The father who had insisted that Jaime don the white cloak, preventing his eventual inheritance of Casterly Rock. The father who had displayed all pride, no love. Tywin Lannister walked among the rows of gold ingots and caskets with that measured stride of his. He looked for all the world like a man who was unstoppable, a single presence mightier than any petty king. Jaime had turned to go, not wanting to speak, not wanting to hear what his father might say of Tyrion's escape. His father had a way of seeing through falsehood, a way of pinning Jaime with that glare and siphoning the truth from him like a fisherman hooking a trout. Jaime had moved to leave, only for Tywin to turn, and the torchlight flickered in his green eyes, so like Jaime's own. "I know what you did," Tywin said quietly. His voice did not echo here. The space seemed to swallow it and hold it. Jaime froze. For a second, he wanted to deny, but he saw in Tywin's face a fury that was laced with triumph. And, for the briefest moment, Jaime felt that he was once again that young boy desperate to please, desperate to make the realm see him not as a dishonorable whelp, but as a man. He remembered nothing of drawing his sword, only that Tywin's next words came out in a lashing hiss, condemnation, threats, dire warnings about Tyrion. Jaime saw the lines in his father's face, the deep grooves carved by decades of weighty decisions. Suddenly, that weight seemed to press on Jaime too. Tywin's entire legacy, built on gold and fear, all that Tywin had stolen from his children, all the cruelty that had molded Jaime into a man he scarcely recognized. Something snapped within him, quick as the flick of a blade. What he did next he would relive 1,000 times in nights to come. He would conjure up the precise shape of his father's mouth, half open to deliver some final condemnation, perhaps to call the guards, to raise the entire castle against Jaime. He would recall the tension in the cords of Tywin's neck as he realized, too late, that Jaime was not stepping aside. And he would recall the savage, unstoppable force in his own arm as he drove his sword into Tywin's stomach, felt the thick resistance of flesh, the abrupt gush of warmth that spread over the hilt. Tywin's mouth opened wide, but no words emerged. Only an exhalation, half-labored, half in disbelief. Jaime felt his breath catch in his throat. His eyes stung, but no tears came. The moment seemed outside time, unimaginable, even as he watched Tywin's knees buckle. The torch on the wall sputtered, sending shadows dancing over the old stones. Jaime expected his father to curse him or spit upon him, but Tywin merely stared, and something like shock or regret flickered there, as fleeting as a spark, extinguished in the final darkness. Tywin sagged to the ground and did not rise. For an instant, Jaime did not move. He looked down at the sword in his hand, felt the sticky fluid on his glove, the metallic tang in his nostrils. The center of his chest felt as if it had been split open by his father's own blade. For all the times he had hated Tywin, for all the nights he had cursed him, for every vile ultimatum, some part of Jaime had never believed he would truly lose his father, or that he himself would be the instrument of that loss. He knelt, removing his golden hand, the clamp that replaced the one that had been severed, and pressed it against his father's chest, as though that might stop the slow drainage of life. It was a foolish impulse. Tywin Lannister, mightiest lord of the West, was already gone. Jaime stared at the body for a long moment, waiting for the trembling in his legs to subside. Then he looked around, as if expecting to see the shades of the seven past judgment from the gloom. No one was there. He had to act. Quietly, swiftly, Jaime rose. He stilled his heartbeat, forced his mind to become a swordsman's mind. Controlled, cold, analytical. He had lived in this palace of cunning his entire adult life. He knew how to hide secrets, yet he also knew that Tywin's murder would not remain secret for long. He considered for a moment the madness of trying to frame someone else. Oberyn Martell was dead, Tyrion was gone, Varys had vanished. This was not a puzzle with easy solutions. But a Lannister does not shy away from the consequences of his actions. He found himself thinking, ironically echoing his father's own old lecture. A Lannister does what must be done. Jaime turned on his heel and moved swiftly through the corridor. He wiped the sword on an old rag, cleaned his golden hand as best he could, and forced his legs to carry him out of the storeroom, up the hidden steps. There were few guards in this part of the Red Keep at that hour. Those he passed saluted him with respect. The Kingsguard cloak he wore still commanded obedience, though he felt the weight of it shift unnaturally on his shoulders, as though it might slip off and reveal his crime. At the top of the stairs, he emerged into a corridor that led toward the royal apartments. He turned the other way, heading instead for his own quarters. His mind raced with questions. Where was Cersei now? Would she suspect him? Could he maintain that he had found Tywin murdered by some other means? Did he want to? He realized, with a sickening lurch, that he did not want to lie. Perhaps some part of him, battered by shame and guilt, was beyond pretense. Let the realm know that Jaime Lannister had ended his father's life, for reasons that belonged solely to him. Yet that was madness, was it not? If he confessed, it would mean the headsman's block. The king, Tommen, his nephew, though the realm believed him to be Jaime's nephew only, would be a puppet in his council's hands. Cersei might shield Jaime, or she might cast him aside if it suited her. Could he truly trust her to do otherwise? He took a moment to quell these roiling thoughts. There was no time for dithering. He retrieved spare clothes from his chest and changed out of his soiled garb. He carefully stashed the blood-stained garments. Next, he cleaned the golden hand. It bore a few faint smears near the fingers. He recalled pressing the cold metal to Tywin's chest in that hopeless attempt to do what? Save him? Apologize? He closed his eyes and forced the memory aside. For now, he would make no announcement, give no sign that this night was any different than the last. Standing in the gloom of his chamber, he pressed his lips together. If he tried to hide the body, the entire Red Keep would be in turmoil soon enough with the disappearance of the hand of the king. That might cause more suspicion than simply letting the corpse be discovered. No, best to let them find Tywin wherever he lay, slain in that secret place. Then they would search for answers. The Lannisters would descend into turmoil, with Cersei at the head. And when the dust settled, Jaime would do what he had to do. Claim Casterly Rock, uphold the name, or vanish into the wilderness. But vanish? That was not him. He had worn the white cloak for half his life, but it was never truly his. That cloak had been foisted on him to keep him from inheriting the rock. And now Tywin lay dead at his hands. He stared into the dark corner of the room. Though he had no illusions of the Seven, or of redemption, he felt the need to whisper a prayer. "Forgive me," he said softly, though he did not know to whom he spoke. Tyrion? The mother who died birthing him? The father now dead by Jaime's own blade? or the children he had fathered by the woman he called sister. The words seemed empty, even as he murmured them, and so he waited, forcing himself not to shudder at every sound that drifted through the corridor. Eventually, he heard the cry rise from somewhere deep in the castle. Someone had found Tywin. The calls of alarm echoed, and Jaime forced his breathing to remain slow and steady. A part of him, that caged, cunning part, recognized he should show himself, gather with the rest, act the part of the concerned son. He steeled himself and stepped into the hallway. He found a small throng of guards, faces white under torchlight, rushing down the corridor. They nearly ran into him. "Sir Jaime," one said, wide-eyed. "Lord Tywin, Someone said he's been murdered, Jaime let the shock show on his face. It wasn't entirely difficult to feign, for his heart was beating faster than a racing horse. "Show me," he said, letting authority ring in his tone, and he joined them in their sprint down the steps. When they reached the hidden corridor, they found a handful of men standing around Tywin's body. One was on his knees, pressing fingers to the unmoving chest. Another was splayed against the wall, face pale, as if he had retched. Jaime moved through them. As he laid eyes on his father's corpse once more, his breath seized in his throat. The old man's eyes, still open, stared at the ceiling. The sword wound in his gut glistened wet in the torchlight. Cersei arrived then, breathless, wearing a bedrobe trimmed with ermine. Her hair was unbound, falling to her shoulders. "Father!" she cried, voice choked with shock and anger. She pushed past the guards, pressed a hand to his chest as if to find life still there. Then she turned, eyes blazing, pinned them on Jaime. "Do something," she demanded, her voice trembling. "Summon a maester. Someone get Pycelle." A pair of knights rushed to obey, disappearing into the gloom. A few moments later, a swirl of courtiers arrived, drawn by the commotion, and soon the corridor was crowded with lords, ladies, servants, all of them wearing faces of astonishment or horror. Pycelle hobbled in, breath rasping, cursing the late hour. The old man knelt by Tywin, listened for a heartbeat, checked for breath, only to shake his head gravely. His eyes flicked to Jaime, but Pycelle said nothing, too lost in the moment. Cersei stood up, a faint quiver in her lips that she tried to hide. "Who did this?" she demanded. No one answered. Some of the gold cloaks began to examine the area, searching for footprints, the murder weapon, any sign of a culprit. None were found. One man found a rag stained with blood, half hidden behind a chest, but it bore no crest, no name. Cersei's gaze lingered on every face, raw with suspicion. Jaime, controlling his expression, set his jaw. If she suspected him, she did not show it, not yet. What followed was a madness of accusations and commands. The king was awakened. Tommen, so young and confused, arrived in the flickering torchlight, eyes wide as he saw his grandfather dead on the floor. Servants were questioned, roused from their beds. A dozen of them babbled rumors. Some said Tyrion had been seen in the corridors, though that seemed impossible, for Tyrion's cell was found empty only that night. Varys was nowhere to be found, leading to more speculation. Tensions soared. Jaime spoke little, but played the role of the concerned son who had been in his own room, waiting for word on Tyrion's rumored escape. If Cersei's eyes flicked to him once or twice, it might have been suspicion or only grief. "I'll find who did this," she said in a low voice, standing before the body, hands trembling despite her efforts to appear composed. "They will wish the stranger took them first." A vow that the onlookers murmured agreement to, some out of fear, others out of genuine sympathy. Tywin had never been beloved, but he had been respected. And, more importantly, he had been feared. As dawn spread its pale light across the Red Keep, Cersei ordered Tywin's body prepared. Pycelle insisted on a formal washing, preserving the same procedure given to kings. Indeed, Tywin had been hand of the king and the realm's most powerful lord. All would soon know of his demise. It would be near impossible to keep this scandal contained. Whispers were already flying across King's Landing like a flock of crows. Jaime heard them. Some said Tyrion had done it. Others said the Martells had hidden assassins. A few whispered that even the Queen might have had reason to rid herself of her father's dominating shadow. The rumors twisted and changed from mouth to mouth, none of them quite pointing at Jaime. Not yet. Jaime returned to his chambers. He removed his sword belt, letting it fall to the table with a dull clank. He realized he still wore the sword that had ended Tywin's life. He stared at the scabbard, wrestling with an odd mixture of guilt and numbness. He had always despised the vow to kill Aerys Targaryen, once upon a time, but that had been a murder of necessity. He had saved thousands of lives. He was not sure he could name necessity here. Rage, frustration, or a final, desperate wish to escape the yoke his father had placed on him. A quiet knock sounded at the door. He froze. So soon? Calmly, he commanded, "Enter." The door cracked open, and to his disquiet, it was Cersei. Her hair was still unbound, though she had thrown on a cloak over her robe. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, her gaze sweeping across his room as if seeking ghosts. Then her eyes settled on him. They were alone, a man and a woman, though they shared the same blood. Jaime felt the same old pull, that twisted longing. But the memory of Tywin's cooling corpse lay between them. He waited for her to speak. She watched him, her green eyes suspicious. "Where were you tonight?" she asked, her voice controlled, almost too calm. "Sleeping," Jaime lied. "I was told Tyrion fled. I searched for him briefly, but there was no sign. I returned here." She stepped closer. He caught a faint scent of night flowers in her hair, and the memory of her in his bed once upon a time came back like a blow to the chest. "You swear it?" she asked. "I know you freed him, Jaime. Did you hope he would be merciful to father?" She let out a bitter laugh, though it was choked. Well, the imp wasn't. Jaime tensed. So she believed Tyrion had done it. Likely half of King's Landing did. Perhaps Tyrion's prior vow, to kill Tywin if he ever got the chance, had sown the seeds. "I don't know," Jaime managed. "I can't say what Tyrion might do." He saw the flicker in her eyes, that glimmer of anger and heartbreak. He could not blame her. He had helped Tyrion escape. That fact alone might place him under suspicion. But for now, it also provided a convenient suspect in Tyrion himself. Still, he felt faintly ill at letting his little brother take the blame. Even as that guilt gnawed at him, he reminded himself that confessing the truth would not bring Tywin back, nor would it help Tyrion. Tyrion was long gone from King's Landing, presumably. With any luck, he might be bound for the Free Cities or someplace where no Lannister could reach him. Cersei bit her lip, hard enough that Jaime thought she might draw blood. "He's gone, Jaime. Our father, gone. There is no more cunning mind to guide us, no one to hold the realm in check." She paused, looking into his eyes. Her voice turned brittle. "We must step forward now. I must step forward. Tommen is too young to rule, and Margaery Tyrell is circling him like a hawk. The Tyrells will press for more influence. They'll want to fill the vacuum father left. But I won't let them." Her teeth bared in a slight snarl. "We are the lions still, and we must protect our pride." Jaime forced his face to remain still. "Yes," he said, the single syllable feeling hollow. He wondered if she suspected him in her secret heart. But she offered no direct accusation. Instead, after a moment, she leaned in and caught his face with her hands, pressing her brow to his. The gesture was intimate, but carried more sorrow than passion. "Stay close to me, Jaime," she whispered. "I can't trust anyone else. Promise me." He swallowed, hearing the frantic edge in her voice. She was frightened. Tywin had been a pillar, an unyielding figure who cast a shadow over them all, but also shielded them from external threats. Now he was gone, and Cersei must have felt the noose of the Tyrell alliance, of the cunning lords in the council, and of unseen foes from Dorne or from the Iron Islands, or from across the narrow sea. The realm was not at peace. Even the north was uncertain, rumors swirling of the Boltons and the last Stark girl. Tywin had been the bulwark, and that bulwark had crumbled. Jaime nodded, placing his hands over hers. "I promise." He meant it. He felt a wave of pity for her, and perhaps for himself as well. They were fatherless children once more, left to fight for their house's survival. She pressed a swift kiss to his cheek, let her hand linger on his shoulder, and then left. Jaime exhaled. He felt his entire body shake with the release of tension, and he squeezed his eyes shut, cursing himself for a dozen kinds of fool. Yet the path had been chosen, and now he had to walk it. In the days that followed, King's Landing erupted with speculation. Tywin Lannister's corpse was laid out in the Great September for a time, so that lords and small folk alike could pay their respects. A funeral was planned, grand and gilded, though the stench in the Great September, Tywin's body decaying in the heat, became infamous. The entire city smelled of moral and literal rot. Priests chanted the rites, as if that would stave off the stink of death. Jaime attended these rituals, standing with Cersei and Tommen at the front, wearing the polished armor and white cloak of the Kingsguard. He endured the stares, the whispered talk, the curious glances that wanted to see if he would weep. He did not. He kept his face impassive, remembering how Tywin had demanded that Lannisters display their pride and not their sorrow. All the while, small councils were held, day after day, to decide how the realm would move forward. Cersei was the queen regent, Tommen but a boy king. The Tyrells pressed for more offices, and Cersei balked. She appointed Qyburn as the master of whisperers in Varys' absence, ignoring the outcry from Pycelle and others. She demanded that the city watch double their efforts to find Tyrion, or glean any scrap of news about him. But Tyrion was gone, vanished as though the wind itself had whisked him away. At last, Tywin's body was taken to the Rock, to Casterly Rock, for interment. It was a stately procession, heavy with gold banners bearing the Crimson Lion. Jaime rode at the front, with Ser Marentrant and Ser Boros Blunt behind him, while Cersei rode in a carriage with Tommen. The entire route from the capital to the west was lined with curious onlookers, some bowing in respect, some spitting curses under their breath for the man they blamed for the realm's ills. Jaime barely noted them. His gaze was fixed on the road, on each mile that brought him closer to that seat of his father's power. Casterly Rock, the fortress he had grown up in but never believed he would inherit. The fortress that had belonged to Tywin Lannister, the seat of House Lannister's might, that Jaime had always been barred from by virtue of the White Cloak. The fortress that might now, ironically and horrifyingly, fall to him because of what he had done. They arrived in Lannisport amidst the flurry of local lords, all gathering to pay final respects. Lord Damian Marbrand, Lord Brax, Lady Crakehall, and half a dozen others. The funeral in the west was grander still, the lion banners rippling against the sea breeze, the great septier adorned in gold leaf, the priests chanting in deeper voices. Jaime stood near the casket, feeling a numbness behind his eyes. Cersei stood on the other side, face pale but set. They had not spoken much on the journey. She had been busy with Tommen, and with throwing subtle barbs at Margaery Tyrell, who had come with them. Margaery was quick to comfort Tommen, to show her face as a future queen who cared for the realm. But Cersei's eyes were always watchful, always suspicious. When at last Tywin was laid to rest in the crypts beneath the rock, Jaime followed the pallbearers, flanked by men whose faces he recognized from childhood. He felt a sense of vertigo, as though stepping back into the halls of memory. The rock was an imposing structure, carved partly from the great rock itself that overlooked the sunset sea. Within, it was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, storehouses, sculleries, training yards. Jaime had run through these halls as a boy, chasing after Tyrion, or sneaking off to see Cersei. Now he walked them as a man, one hand replaced by gold, a lifetime of war and shame etched in the lines of his face. The crypt was cool, torches guttering in stone sconces. The Lannister dead lay in alcoves, each with carved effigies, knights and ladies in silent grandeur. Tywin's casket was placed among them, the echo of footsteps the only sound. The High Septon murmured the final prayers, and then it was done. Tywin Lannister was sealed away behind a great stone, never to stride across these halls again, never to bellow orders, never to mold his children's destinies with his relentless will. Jaime found himself wishing he could hear Tywin's voice again, even if it was to reprimand him. And then he felt an icy coil of guilt. He was the reason Tywin's voice was silenced. Afterward, an assembly was held in the great hall of Casterly Rock, a hall shaped by pillars carved like lions' legs. The floor was polished marble, the banners hung from a vaulted ceiling. The lords and ladies gathered to hear who would step forward to rule the Westerlands. In the normal course, if Jaime had not been a Kingsguard, the seat would pass to him. But with Jaime wearing the white cloak, the next in line would presumably be Tyrion, who was condemned as a kinslayer and fugitive. That left only Cersei, but she was Queen Regent in King's Landing. The question loomed: who would Tywin have designated as Lord of Casterly Rock? Now that no obvious male heir stood untainted, Cersei took her seat at the front, flanked by Ser Meryn. Jaime remained standing to the side, uncertain how best to conduct himself. Tommen was back in a smaller solar, away from the press with Marjorie at his side. As the chatter rose, a hush fell once Cersei rose to speak. She wore black still, her hair bound in a net. "My lords," she began, her voice poised despite her mourning garb, "we gather in sorrow to mourn the passing of my father, Lord Tywin Lannister. Now we must see to the future of the Rock." Several of the lords lowered their heads. Others shot quick glances among themselves. They all knew the precariousness of this situation. House Lannister was too powerful to simply allow the seat to pass to a distant cousin without a clear word from Tywin. Yet the white cloak complicated Jaime's inheritance, and Tyrion's fugitive status complicated his. Cersei took a breath, measuring her words. "As you know, Lord Tywin never rescinded Jaime's inheritance. Rather, my father persuaded him to join the Kingsguard to secure the family's alliance with the crown." She paused, letting the lords recall that moment from history. "Yet times have changed. Aerys Targaryen is dead. The realm is under Baratheon rule with my son on the throne. Our father recognized that new arrangements might be necessary. Before his death, Lord Tywin told me of his desire to see Jaime released from his vows. It was his wish that Jaime become Lord of Casterly Rock, to lead the Westerlands and continue the family line." A whisper erupted across the hall. Many were startled, though some seemed to expect such a claim. They all knew it was questionable whether one could simply release a Kingsguard from his vows. But in the chaos and uncertainty of these times, Tommen on the throne, Cersei as regent, the weight of Lannister gold, perhaps it could be done with the right documents or royal decree. Jaime himself was stunned, though he suspected that if Tywin had survived, he would have found a way to force this arrangement eventually. He thought of how his father once told him that a man's vows were but words, and that the future of House Lannister outweighed them. Cersei raised a hand for silence. "I have spoken with the king, who has agreed to issue a royal decree that Ser Jaime is hereby released from his vows to the Kingsguard, in recognition of his father's final wish and the realm's need for strong leadership in the West. My lords, I present to you Jaime Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock." All eyes turned to Jaime. He felt a wave of conflicting emotions: triumph, horror, guilt. He stepped forward slowly, his golden hand resting at his side, the other hand clenched. "My lords," he said, his voice carrying, "I accept this responsibility, as it was my father's will." The words felt heavy. In truth, Tywin had never said such a thing to Jaime's face. Jaime realized that Cersei must be forging this, or at least shaping the truth to fit their advantage. But the lords in the hall nodded, some looking relieved, some uncertain. Lannister gold and the fear of Lannister might carried weight. He felt the hush descend again, all those eyes upon him. And in that hush, Jaime thought, if they only knew what truly happened in that corridor, how I plunged my sword into Tywin's belly. Would they kneel then, or recoil? Would they cry out in revulsion? He pushed the thought away. For the survival of the house, he would play the part. In the days that followed, the paperwork was prepared, the seals affixed, and Tommen's official decree arrived via Raven, presumably penned by Cersei and stamped by the royal seal. Jaime was thus relieved of his Kingsguard vows, named Lord of Casterly Rock, Warden of the West, and charged with upholding the crown's peace in the region. It was done. The morning after the official investiture, Jaime stood on a balcony overlooking the sea. The dawn sun glinted off the water, and the wind tugged at his cloak, no longer white but crimson, embroidered with the Lannister lion. The weight of it felt unfamiliar. He flexed the fingers of his remaining hand, thinking of all that had changed. He was no longer the Kingslayer in white, but a lord. A father might have been proud, if that father were not the man Jaime had murdered. The thought made his stomach churn. Below him in the courtyard, he saw the movements of a household stirring to life. Guards in gold and crimson livery patrolled the walls. Stable boys rushed about with feed. Dogs barked. Maids passed in small gaggles carrying laundry. This was now Jaime's domain. Did he want it? For so long, Jaime had only ever wanted to be a good swordsman, a knight of skill. That dream was stolen when he lost his sword hand. He had tried to adapt, but the pang of that loss never left. Now his father's seat was thrust upon him. He heard a footstep behind him. Turning, he found Ser Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, a burly man with a level gaze. Kevan had come to King's Landing for the funeral and had remained to help settle matters in the west. He bowed his head slightly. "My lord," he said, his voice echoing the new reality. "May I speak with you?" Jaime nodded. "You needn't call me that, uncle. It feels strange enough as it is." Kevan gave him a faint smile. "Perhaps so, but it is proper. We must maintain order, especially now. The realm watches us. The West must stand firm." Jaime understood. "Of course. What is it you wish to speak about?" Kevan sighed, stepping closer, leaning over the balcony rail. For a moment, he gazed at the sea, as though searching for words amid the waves. Lord Tywin put the realm in order after the chaos of Robert's rebellion and the War of the Five Kings. He was a strong man, but also a harsh one. Now that he is gone, we Lannisters still hold power. But we stand on precarious ground, burdened by debts, old alliances that may shift. The Tyrells might see opportunity. The Iron Islands have grown bold under Euron Greyjoy, or so the rumors say. And there is talk of a Targaryen girl across the sea with dragons, though I cannot say how true. We must be prepared. Jaime nodded. "Yes, it's a viper's nest, uncle. The question is how we keep from being bitten." Kevan nodded in turn. "Exactly. Will you remain here at the Rock, or return to King's Landing?" "The Queen Regent." "My sister," Jaime interjected. "Yes, your sister," Kevan allowed. "She will want you close, I imagine. But we also need a firm hand here. The Rock cannot go leaderless. And with Tyrion on the run, the only other Lannister of direct blood is you. Unless you mean to pass it all to Lancel." Kevan sounded doubtful of that, for Lancel had taken holy vows and grown increasingly fervent. Jaime exhaled. "I don't know yet. Perhaps I should return to the capital to guide Tommen, and keep Cersei from indulging her worst impulses. But the West also needs—" He stopped, the swirl of decisions looming before him. "What would you advise, uncle?" Kevan considered. "In truth, I'd advise you to appoint a Castellan you trust. Remain here long enough to secure the loyalty of the local bannermen. Then return to King's Landing to ensure House Lannister's influence over the throne remains strong. We cannot allow the Tyrells to overshadow us. As for me, I intend to remain here for a time, to assist in whatever capacity you require." Jaime gave a tight smile. "I'm grateful for that. You were always the stable one in the family, uncle. The one with sense." He paused, bracing himself. "I'll do as you suggest. I'll remain at the Rock a while, see to our bannermen, name a Castellan, then head back to the capital. If Cersei requires me sooner, I'll leave as needed. And after that—" He hesitated, feeling the weight of the future pressing him. "After that, we see how the realm weathers this storm." Kevan gripped his shoulder gently, a hint of warmth in the gesture. "You carry a great burden, Jaime. I hope you do not bear it alone." A great burden, indeed, Jaime thought, though it was heavier than Kevin realized. He thanked his uncle, parted ways, and made for the Rock's armory and training yard, a place he had once known intimately. He found it mostly unchanged, save for a few new racks and some younger men drilling with swords and spears. Their instructor was a gray-bearded master-at-arms who saluted Jaime on sight. Jaime walked among the men, giving short comments on their stance, the angle of their strikes. He remembered days when he had been the golden youth among them, unstoppable with a blade. Now, with one hand gone, he might have struggled against a half-trained boy. The anger flared anew in him, and he resolved to keep practicing, to further refine his left-hand technique. He would never be the warrior he was, but he refused to remain helpless. That afternoon, in the hall, he received the local lords who had come for Tywin's funeral. A line of them presented themselves, offering condolences and pledging fealty anew to Jaime. He accepted their words, gave the expected replies, tried to appear confident, all the while remembering the father who had taught him how to wear a mask of composure. If any lord suspected something amiss, they kept it to themselves. Later, in the quiet of his solar, Jaime sank into a chair beside the hearth. He cradled a cup of wine in his good hand, half listening to the crackle of the fire. His mind drifted to Tyrion. He wondered where his brother might be. Had Tyrion heard the news of Tywin's death? Did he imagine how it happened? Perhaps Tyrion would never know that Jaime had wielded the blade. Or perhaps he would guess somehow. Tyrion was clever that way, always seeing the angles. Jaime tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered, an ache behind his eyes. He recalled that final conversation with Tyrion, just before helping him escape. Tyrion, furious, had claimed that Cersei was a monster, that Tywin would have killed him without hesitation. Jaime had tried to deny it, but deep down he had known it was true. He told himself he would find Tyrion again someday, perhaps beg his forgiveness for not revealing all the truths. Now those truths were heavier than ever. Days lengthened into weeks. Jaime learned the intricacies of lordship, managing grain stores, hearing disputes about borders between lands, dealing with merchants from Lannister. Kevin helped with the duties, guiding Jaime where needed. On the surface, House Lannister functioned. The gold still shone, the lion still roared. But beneath, unease festered, rumors swirling that Tywin's murderer might be the imp, or a Sellsword, or some other clandestine enemy. The city of King's Landing had started to question whether House Lannister was as fearsome without its patriarch. News traveled slowly from the capital, but ravens came every few days, bearing messages from Cersei, urgent and frustrated. She complained of the Tyrells, of how Marjorie grew ever more beloved among the small folk, of how the council questioned the crown's finances. She pressed Jaime to return, warning that if they did not stand together, the vultures would descend. She wrote that she had no faith in Kevin's lukewarm manner, and that she needed Jaime's presence at her side to keep Tommen safe. Yet Jaime also received messages from other parts of the realm. Riverrun was under Frey siege, though the Blackfish still held out. The Vale seemed quiet, but there was talk of Peter Baelish maneuvering for more influence. The north was a chaos of snow and shifting alliances under the Boltons. As for the Iron Islands, the rumors about Euron Greyjoy's ambitions grew louder. And across the sea, stories of Daenerys Targaryen multiplied, speaking of freed slaves and growing armies. Jaime was no spymaster, but he understood well enough. The realm was a cauldron about to boil over again. 2 months after Tywin's death, Jaime finally bowed to Cersei's pleas. He placed Ser Davin Lannister as Castellan of Casterly Rock, with Kevin's oversight, and summoned his retainers for a journey back to King's Landing. He took a modest escort, 50 men, and left instructions for the defense of Lannisport should any Ironborn raids occur. Then he set out on the road, once more crossing the green fields and rolling hills, returning to the city he had departed not so long ago in a funeral procession. This time he came as Lord of Casterly Rock, not as a Kingsguard. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned inside him, and he rode in silence much of the way. When they arrived at the gates of King's Landing, Jaime saw the city was the same sprawling mess of stacked hovels and palaces perched along the muddy roads. The stench was the same. A mixture of waste, sea salt, roasting meat, and hopelessness. The gold cloaks recognized him easily, of course, and let him pass, though they cast curious glances at the gold and crimson surcoat he wore rather than white. He rode straight to the Red Keep, crossing the drawbridge over the dry moat, entering the courtyard. Servants hurried out to greet him, bowing and scraping, each eager to show deference to the new Lord of the West. Jaime dismounted, feeling ill at ease. He had lived here for so long as a man of the Kingsguard. Now he was what exactly? Cersei emerged from inside, wearing a dress of deep Lannister red, her hair piled high in a regal style. She looked relieved to see him, though also tense. She embraced him formally before the court, then dismissed most of the onlookers so they could speak in private. In her solar, she poured them both wine, breathing heavily. "You took your time," she remarked, not unkindly. "I was beginning to think you'd abandoned me." Jaime sipped, letting the wine's bitterness fill his throat. "I had obligations to see to. The West needed some semblance of order. Besides, Uncle Kevin insists that we must keep a strong presence at the Rock." She nodded. Yes. Well, you're here now." She set her wine down, moving closer, lowering her voice. "Jaime, everything is unraveling. The council challenges me at every turn. Marjorie flits about Tommen like a pretty butterfly, urging him to this or that. And then there's the matter of the faith growing in power under the High Sparrow. Did you know they have Lancel among their ranks, preaching in the streets?" Her lip curled. "As if he hadn't sinned enough with me, he dares to don a holy robe and pretend to be above us all now." Jaime listened. So the city was teetering with the faith growing bold. He recalled the last time the faith had real power. The era of the Targaryens had ended that arrangement, or so it was said, but now the vacuum left by war had allowed them to flourish. "You want me to help you with the council? The Tyrells?" He frowned, swirling his wine. "I'm no statesman, Cersei." "Perhaps not," she said. "But you're the Lord of Casterly Rock, the Warden of the West. They will listen when you speak, or they'll know your men will ride against them. We must keep Tommen safe from their manipulations. Marjorie is sweet, or so she pretends, but I know she aims to rule through my son." Jaime set the goblet down. "Cersei, we can't keep pushing the Tyrells away. We rely on them for coin, for grain, they rely on us for gold, for the prestige of the Lannister alliance." She cut him off. "And if they grow too bold, we can show them what steel we have left." She spoke with a determined tilt of her chin. "Our father did not cow them with half measures. We must do the same." He thought of Tywin. The memory was always there, under the surface, threatening to rise. A father he had hated, a father he had loved, a father he had killed. He forced it down. "Very well, I'll stand with you in council. We must be careful though, not rash." "Agreed," Cersei said, though the slight twitch in her lips indicated she had little patience for caution. "We need to reassert the might of House Lannister. And if the faith moves against us or the Tyrells scheme, we must be ready to crush them. For Tommen's sake." Jaime recalled the vow he had given her the night Tywin was discovered dead, that he would stand by her. "As you say," he agreed, but inside, doubts simmered. That night, a feast was held in the Red Keep to welcome Jaime's return. The hall was ablaze with torches, the tables laden with roast fowl, suckling pig, fresh bread, and flagons of wine. The band played lively tunes, though the mood among the gathered lords was tense. Jaime sat near the head of the hall, beside Cersei, with Tommen on her other side, a small boy forced into the role of king. Marjorie Tyrell sat beside Tommen, smiling sweetly, her grandmother Olenna Tyrell a few seats away, hawkish in her gaze. Court members chatted, filling the hall with a dull roar of conversation. Jaime found his appetite lacking. He toyed with a piece of roast, scanning the crowd, seeing the uneasy alliances that formed in every corner. There was Pycelle, slurping wine, Qyburn speaking quietly to an underling, Mace Tyrell boasting about something or other. The Kingsguard stood behind Tommen, minus the seat Jaime had once held among them. Now his seat was at the table. He felt as though he did not belong there or anywhere. Cersei leaned in. "You're quiet tonight. Just considering the future," Jaime replied, managing a small smile. "And your new measures for controlling the city." She tapped her finger on the table, her rings glinting. "Yes, well, I've met with that wretched High Sparrow. He's unyielding about punishment for crimes. He wants the faith's laws recognized. Men to be tried for sins of adultery, incest, all manner of filth. As if the realm needed more trials." She clenched her jaw. "I might have him removed, but that could spark a revolt among the small folk. They adore him, thinking he's some holy beggar come to deliver them from sin and tyranny." Jaime considered the irony of that. The talk of incest. If the High Sparrow's moral crusade gained traction, it could threaten them both. "Then we need a gentler hand," he said. "Not a show of force that would turn the small folk against us." She sipped her wine. "You've grown cautious, my love." Her words touched something in him. He glanced at her, seeing the faint smirk on her face, the reminder of a time when love had bound them closely, but so much had changed. He thought again of the father he had taken from her, and swallowed the confession he could never utter. "I simply want us to keep the realm intact," he said. "Father would not have wanted chaos." "No," she agreed softly, though a hint of bitterness lingered in her gaze. "He wouldn't have." She said no more, and Jaime wondered if she was thinking of that last day, that last conversation she ever had with Tywin. She likely felt robbed of closure, never knowing who had swung the blade. The dread in Jaime's gut coiled tighter. They retired late, each to their separate chambers. In the weeks that followed, Jaime attended small councils with Cersei. He did not speak often, but when he did, lords listened. He had presence now, not just as the Kingslayer, but as the Lord of the Rock. Yet the tension with Margaery and Olenna Tyrell grew daily. Each subtle jab or proposal from their side met with cool deflection from Cersei. Meanwhile, the Faith militant was rearmed, an act that concerned Jaime deeply. There were rumors of them patrolling the streets, arresting drunkards, harassing women of ill repute. Cersei, in her bid to restore some sense of alliance with the Faith, had allowed them certain privileges, hoping they would target her enemies. Jaime feared that plan might backfire. Amidst all this, Jaime heard no news of Tyrion. It was as if his brother had evaporated from the face of Westeros. Little birds reported sightings as far away as Pentos or Volantis, but nothing concrete. Each rumor stirred Jaime's uneasy conscience. Tyrion was an exiled man, condemned as a kinslayer for killing Tywin, yet the true kinslayer was Jaime. He sometimes woke from nightmares of Tywin's eyes staring at him, accusing him in death. On other nights, he dreamed of Tyrion condemning him, calling him an oathbreaker anew. One day, while Jaime was reviewing troop formations on the practice field, a messenger from the harbor arrived, panting. The man reported that a Braavosi ship had docked, carrying envoys who claimed to represent the Iron Bank. They sought immediate audience with the crown about outstanding debts. Jaime grimaced. The realm owed vast sums, especially since the wars, and Tywin had always balanced the books with cunning. Without Tywin's mastery, the Iron Bank was growing impatient. Cersei met with them in the throne room, draped in her regal attire. Tommen perched on the Iron Throne looking small and unsure. The Braavosi were polite but firm, insisting that the debts be repaid according to schedule, or alternative measures would be sought. Jaime stood by Cersei's side, silent, letting her posture exude confidence. But he saw the strain in her face as she promised partial repayment soon, with the remainder to follow. Where that gold would come from, Jaime did not know. The Lannister mines at Castamere were long exhausted, the ones beneath the rock rumored to be dwindling, and the crown's coffers were emptier than the realm suspected. Their only recourse might be to tax the Tyrells, which would further sour that alliance. When the envoys left, Cersei seethed in private. She turned to Jaime in her solar, face flushed. "They dare to threaten us? We are the crown, not some petty merchant. If they hound us, let them see what it means to anger a lion." Jaime rubbed his temple, feeling a headache brewing. The Iron Bank is not easily cowed. Father always warned never to cross them. Perhaps we should pay what we can, negotiate a new timetable. Cersei flung a goblet across the room. It hit the wall and clattered, spilling wine over the tapestry. We cannot look weak. Not to them, not to the Tyrells, not to anyone. She stood, breathing heavily, fists clenched. Everything is unraveling, she repeated, voice laced with desperation. Jaime approached her, placing a tentative hand on her arm. We will find a way, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. She stared at him, eyes flicking to his golden hand, then back to his face. I need you, she said softly, a catch in her voice. I've always needed you, Jaime. He hesitated. Once, such words would have thrilled him, made him push her against the wall in a heated embrace. But now he felt only a dull ache. He remembered how she had spurned him upon his return from captivity, how she had looked at his stump with something like pity or revulsion. He recalled how distant she had been when he lost his hand, how she had changed. Or was it he who had changed? I'm here, he told her at last, quietly. I will protect you and Tommen however I can. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment. Then she nodded, as if satisfied, and pulled away. Good, she said, regaining her composure. We must stand as one, or the realm devours us. And so, days dragged on in King's Landing, each one fraught with new complications. The small folk grew restless under heavier taxes. The Tyrells pressed for more say in the finances. Cersei's dealings with the faith turned sour. The High Sparrow demanded the Queen Mother rid the court of sinful indulgences, which stoked her fury. Jaime found himself wading deeper into the morass, forced to act as mediator between factions. He disliked the role. He had never had the patience for politics. Tywin had handled such matters so effortlessly, but now Tywin was gone. All the while, the presence of the faith militant grew bolder. They began arresting highborn men accused of sins, from boogery to fathering bastards. Whispers circulated that they might soon challenge the highest powers if they found them wanting. Cersei believed that she could point them toward Margaery, accusing her of adultery or infidelity. Jaime feared a direct assault on the Tyrells would lead to war. He tried to counsel caution, but she seldom listened. It was during one of these tense weeks that the unthinkable occurred. The faith militant arrested Ser Loras Tyrell on charges of boogery, and then, in a shocking turn, also arrested Queen Margaery on charges of adultery. King Tommen was outraged but felt powerless, as Cersei insisted the faith be allowed to do their investigations. Margaery's grandmother, Olenna, threatened to cut off all food supplies to the capital if her granddaughter was not released. Jaime saw it all tilting toward a dangerous precipice. He confronted Cersei in her chambers. You must free Margaery. This is madness, he said, voice tense. You want to fight the Tyrells? Because that is how you'll start a war. She stood by the window, the city lights below. The faith wants to root out moral corruption. It is their call, she said, feigning innocence. I merely allowed them their rightful authority. You practically shoved Loras in front of them, Jaime accused, stepping closer. If you provoke the Tyrells, we could see war again. Or if not war, then a crippling blockade. Think of Tommen's position. Think of your own. She turned to him, eyes flashing. Don't patronize me, Jaime. You want me to bow to Margaery Tyrell? Let her run Tommen's life while she cements her power? I am the Queen Mother. I will not yield our family's future to that simpering rose. She let out a breath. Besides, the Tyrells need us as much as we need them. They won't risk all-out war. Not yet. Jaime felt the hollowness inside him. Then we risk the city starving, or the Iron Bank calling in debts, or something else. Father would have found a more balanced approach. Her face twisted with a sudden fury. Father is not here, is he? She said. He left us to manage this ourselves. And maybe it's better this way. We'll show the realm that we don't need Tywin Lannister to maintain our greatness. We are Lannisters. We do not. She stopped abruptly, her mouth tightening. Jaime stared at her, seeing the anguish beneath her bluster. She missed Tywin as much as she resented him, and in that swirl of emotion, Jaime saw a mirror of himself. He drew a breath. "Cersei, if you push too far, everything might collapse. I beg you to be cautious." His voice trembled slightly. She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Are you losing your nerve, dear brother? You were never so timid before." He swallowed. "I'm trying to keep us safe, says the man who killed the Mad King," she scoffed, though not maliciously. "Since when did you quake at the prospect of bold action?" He did not reply. She studied him a moment longer, then turned away. "Very well, I'll consider your counsel. But my patience with the Tyrells is running thin." That was all she would say. A week later, events took another turn. The Faith militant arrested Cersei herself, accusing her of adultery with Lancel, of incest with Jaime. The city reeled. Jaime was in the yard when he heard, and he felt as if the ground gave way beneath him. She had played with fire, and now it was scorching her. The High Sparrow, seizing on Lancel's confession, had decided no one was above the laws of the faith. King Tommen was left helpless. Jaime rushed to the September of Baelor, demanding answers, but the Faith militant barred him from entry. Tensions soared. He wanted to draw his sword, but he knew that would only end in bloodshed. They were too many, and he was only one man, no longer the unstoppable swordsman he had been in youth. He was forced to retreat to the Red Keep. In the days that followed, Cersei's imprisonment rocked the realm. The Tyrells glowered, seeing it as poetic justice for their own imprisoned kin. The small council was in disarray, with no one sure how to proceed. Tommen locked himself in his chambers, refusing to eat or speak, paralyzed by fear for his mother. Jaime tried everything he could: diplomacy, threats, entreaties to the High Sparrow. None worked. The Faith demanded a trial. They had confessions from Lancel, from some of Cersei's ladies. Rumors abounded that Jaime fathered Tommen, though these rumors had circulated for years. Now the Faith used them as a cudgel. Day after day, Jaime seethed, powerless to free the one woman he had spent his life protecting. He might have been content for Tywin to face a final reckoning. He had been the father who dominated them all. But Cersei, for all her faults, was the mother of his children, was bound to him in ways he could not deny. He could not leave her to rot. At last, he convened a meeting of the remaining council members: Pycelle, Qyburn, Mace Tyrell, who had returned to the city to free his children, and a few lesser lords. Olenna Tyrell refused to attend, calling it a farce. Jaime laid out a proposal. If the Faith did not release Cersei soon, or at least allow bail in the Red Keep, the Crown would consider the Faith in open rebellion and respond accordingly. Mace Tyrell was reluctant, but he too wanted to free Loras and Margaery. Pycelle wrung his hands, mewling about the gods. Qyburn offered his usual quiet solutions, hinting at other means. But in the end, a decision was reached that they must threaten the Faith with the might of the combined Lannister and Tyrell armies. And so, a plan formed for Mace Tyrell to bring men from the Reach to King's Landing, while Jaime gathered men from the Westerlands. They would arrive outside the city in force, confronting the Faith. A dangerous gambit. If the city rose to defend the High Sparrow, the result could be slaughter. But the alternative was to let the Faith hold the royals hostage. Jaime, feeling a knot in his gut, drafted ravens to Casterly Rock, ordering more knights and men-at-arms to mobilize toward the capital. Mace Tyrell departed with an escort to rally his banners. In the midst of this tension, Tommen did nothing but languish, tears in his eyes, as if the weight of the crown was too heavy for him. Jaime attempted to comfort the boy, to reassure him that his mother would be freed soon. But he was not sure he believed his own words. Each passing day made the city more uneasy. The Faith militant walked the streets, seizing suspected sinners. Jaime had lost count of how many men were thrown in cells beneath the September of Baelor. Meanwhile, merchants complained that few dared enter the city to trade, crippling commerce. Whispers circulated that the High Sparrow might declare Tommen a bastard, unfit to rule, if the confessions of incest were upheld. That would spark utter chaos. Jaime felt the realm's foundations trembling, threatening to collapse. And all the while, the secret Jaime carried remained locked inside him. That Tywin had died by his hand, not Tyrion's or some unknown assassin's. He saw how the father's absence had unbalanced everything, how Tywin's ruthless intelligence might have prevented this crisis. In dark moments, Jaime wondered if he had damned them all. But it was too late for regrets. One afternoon, as Jaime was studying a map of the city's defenses, a messenger rushed in. Ser Meryn Trant had arrived from the September with news. Cersei would be permitted a walk of atonement if she confessed to certain charges. Jaime felt his blood run cold, remembering how once the faith had forced women of ill repute or lords' paramours to walk naked through the streets in shame. Could they do this to the Queen Mother? Yes, apparently. He ground his teeth. The High Sparrow was cunning. By offering a partial confession and penance, Cersei might be freed from one charge, while still facing trial for incest. She might prefer that to rotting in a cell, but the humiliation would be profound. He hurried to the Red Keep to speak to Tommen, but the king was paralyzed, uncertain. Hours later, word came that Cersei had agreed to confess to fornication with Lancel, while denying the incest with Jaime. The faith demanded she walk the streets from the September to the Red Keep, barefoot and naked, as the small folk jeered. Jaime felt sick at the thought, and so, on a day bright with cold sunlight, the city turned out to watch the Queen Mother's atonement. Jaime stood on the steps of the Red Keep, arms folded, face like stone. He wanted to gather men and charge in to stop the farce, but she had chosen this path, presumably to buy time and eventual freedom. The faith militant escorted her, forcing her to disrobe at the September. When she appeared in the street, hair roughly shorn, body bared for all to see, the crowd erupted in a cacophony of insults and lewd remarks. Jaime clenched his jaw so tight it ached. He could hardly bear the sight, but he forced himself to watch, compelled by horror and guilt. This was the woman he had loved for so long, the mother of his children, stripped of dignity, forced to shuffle through filth. If Tywin were alive, would this have happened? He saw her step by step, her feet leaving bloody footprints on the cobblestones, pelted by rotten fruit, spittle, curses. She stumbled, rose, continued. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The shame was unimaginable. Jaime wanted to roar and cut through the crowd, but the faith's men ringed her. He would die in the attempt or spark a riot. So he waited, every muscle quivering with tension. Finally, she reached the Red Keep. Guards rushed to wrap her in a cloak, to help her inside. Jaime moved to her side, ignoring the sour stench of the crowd's debris clinging to her. He gently put his cloak around her, feeling her trembling. Her eyes found his, filled with humiliation and anger. Take me to Qyburn," she rasped, as if the world might vanish if she did not receive immediate succor. He nodded, guiding her forward. Inside, Qyburn fussed over her, giving her a blanket, calling for hot water, ointments for the cuts on her feet. Jaime stood by, silent, his heart pounding. Soon, Cersei was carried away to a private chamber to be bathed and dressed. Jaime was left in the corridor outside, fists clenched, wanting to break something, anything, to express the rage and sorrow inside him. That night, after Qyburn had tended her, Jaime gained entry to her room. She lay in bed, propped by pillows, her hair still ragged. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, parted lips. Wordless, he approached. For a time, they simply stared at each other. Then he sank to his knees beside her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wanted to." She silenced him with a trembling hand on his mouth. Her voice was raw. "They made me crawl," she said hoarsely. "I felt their eyes, their hatred, as if I were filth." She let out a sob that she quickly stifled, as if to show weakness shamed her more than anything. "They will pay for this." Jaime said nothing, only took her hand in his, ignoring the awkwardness of the gold hand that hung by his side. He felt a swirl of guilt. This was the house he had inherited, the power he had claimed by murdering Tywin. Yet he could not protect Cersei from the faith, from the swirling political havoc. Everything that Tywin might have shielded them from had come crashing down. And if the truth ever emerged about Tywin's murder, it would bring the entire Lannister legacy to ruin. Cersei turned her face away. "Leave me," she said. "I want to rest." Her voice was thick with unshed tears. Jaime hesitated, wanting to offer comfort, but the moment felt too fractured. He rose, stepping out of the room, letting the door close behind him. In the corridor, he passed Ser Meryn, who dipped his head in greeting. Jaime hardly registered it. He walked aimlessly, feeling the walls closing in. Eventually, he found himself atop a parapet, overlooking the city by moonlight. King's Landing stretched before him, endless rows of buildings, the black water of the bay beyond. A gloom lay over his heart, a sense of foreboding. Tywin was gone, the realm was unraveling, and Jaime found himself powerless to stop it. He leaned against the cold stone, remembering a conversation he'd had with his father years ago, the day he was appointed to the Kingsguard. Tywin had said something like, "You bear our name. You are a Lannister of the Rock. Whatever cloak you wear, never forget your true duty, to further the power of our house." At the time, Jaime had heard only criticism, another demand from a father who never gave affection. Yet now, ironically, Jaime was living that vow, struggling to hold House Lannister together in Tywin's absence. He closed his eyes, inhaling the night air. A storm was on the horizon. In the distance, lightning flickered beyond the walls, momentarily illuminating the city in stark relief. Jaime wished he could run from all of it, but he had chosen this path. He had chosen it with a single thrust of his sword. There was no turning back. Over the next weeks, Cersei slowly recovered, while the tension with the Tyrells reached a boiling point. Margaery remained in custody, and the Tyrell army drew near the city. Jaime corresponded with Kevan and with the Castellan at Casterly Rock, ensuring the Lannister forces were mustered. Word reached them that the Ironborn had launched raids on the coast near Case, causing further alarm in the west. Meanwhile, rumors of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, grown larger still, caused fresh anxiety among certain lords. Jaime felt as though the entire realm quivered on a knife's edge, waiting for the slightest push to send them plunging into war once more. Cersei managed to negotiate a trial by combat for herself, convinced that Qyburn's experiments would yield a champion unstoppable by mortal men. She also pressed for Margaery to face a separate trial. The Faith, unmoved, insisted on their procedures. Jaime saw the madness of it all, how a single spark could ignite chaos in the city. One late evening, after a fruitless session with the small council, Jaime retreated to his chambers, exhausted. He had just shrugged off his cloak when a quiet knock came at his door. He opened it to find Ser Kevan standing there, looking grave. Jaime bade him enter. Kevan shut the door, his face marked by worry. "My lord nephew," he began, voice low, "I come with troubling news. There are whispers in the city about your father's death." Jaime's heart thudded. "Go on," Kevan exhaled. "It seems some suspect Tyrion was not the one who did it. No one has proof, only rumors. But you know how these things spread. Some claim they saw you that night near the secret corridors. Some claim that a guard recognized your voice. All hearsay, no evidence. Still, the rumor is that perhaps you confronted Tywin in anger, that you ended him." Jaime's throat went dry. "Nonsense. Why would I kill my own father?" Kevan nodded. "That is the question. But these rumors are not dying. The Faith might latch onto them, if it suits them. Already they consider you and Cersei guilty of incest. If they can brand you a kinslayer as well, gods help us. The other lords might turn away from us in disgust." Jaime pressed a hand to his forehead, feeling the pounding of blood. "We must quash these rumors. They cannot take root." Kevan placed a hand on his shoulder. "I will do what I can. Silence some tongues, perhaps. But be careful. We stand on dangerous ground. If the Faith calls for an inquest, if they demand a trial—" He trailed off, expression grim. Jaime clenched his teeth. "I understand. "Thank you, uncle." Kevin gave him a sympathetic glance, then left. Jaime stood in the middle of the chamber, the lantern light casting flickering shadows. He thought of how the realm might react if they believed the new Lord of the West to be a kinslayer, no better than Tyrion had been accused of being. It might fracture House Lannister's support. Even his allies might balk. The Tyrells could use it as leverage, perhaps demanding concessions or punishments. The Faith could call for his arrest. Tommen might be lost. Cersei's already precarious position would collapse. Late into the night, Jaime paced, wrestling with the knowledge that all of this was the outcome of that single, irrevocable moment. He had killed Tywin, and the cost was mounting daily. Perhaps in a just world, he would yield himself up, confess. But this was not a just world, and it would bring ruin to the house if he did. Tyrion was somewhere far away, taking the blame for a crime he did not commit, possibly cursing their father's name or Jaime's. The realm buckled under the weight of failing leadership, the dragons rumored across the sea, the Iron Bank's patience wearing thin, the Faith's fanaticism rising. Jaime Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, once Kingsguard, once the realm's most feared swordsman, looked out the narrow window of his chamber. Dawn was breaking, pale and uncertain. He wondered if it would bring salvation or doom, and so he squared his shoulders. He would not flee from the consequences, no matter how dark. He was still a Lannister, still a man with responsibilities. If the realm teetered on the edge, he would do all he could to steady it. Even if that meant forging alliances he despised, cutting down foes he once thought friends, or making decisions Tywin himself might have grimly approved. The road ahead was uncertain, riddled with potential for more bloodshed. But he would walk it. He had no other choice. In the days to come, Jaime faced crisis after crisis. He met with Tyrell envoys, attempting to secure Marjorie's release. He negotiated with the Iron Bank envoys for more time to pay debts, using the Rock's assets as collateral. He quietly worked to stamp out rumors linking him to Tywin's murder, though the rumors lingered in corners of the city. Cersei began planning her trial by combat, trusting in Qyburn's monstrous champion, Ser Robert Strong, though Jaime could see her desperation. Tommen grew paler by the day, pulled between his mother's plight and the demands of the Faith. On the horizon, war brewed. Word reached them that the Boltons in the north were threatened by wild rumors of a resurrected Stark. The Ironborn soared under Euron's leadership, capturing more of the western coast. Dorne stirred restlessly after the death of Oberyn Martell, with Ellaria Sand and her daughters rumored to be plotting vengeance. And across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen's name was repeated by travelers with awe or fear. The realm seemed to prepare for another round of conflict, and House Lannister was perched precariously at the center. One morning, Jaime donned armor of crimson-enameled steel, strapped on the sword that had once killed his father, and stood in the courtyard of the Red Keep, watching a line of Lannister riders arrive from the Rock. They carried the lion banner, gold on red, snapping in the wind. He felt an odd surge of pride and dread. This was the house he led now, for better or worse. If war came, these men would fight under his command. And if the day came when the truth of Tywin's murder spilled into the open, would they still follow him? Duty demanded he put aside such fears. So he stood tall, face grim, and greeted them, his gold hand shining in the sunlight. He thought of the father who had once overshadowed him completely, the father who had shaped an entire realm. Jaime had ended him, in a moment born of fury and despair. Now, that single moment reshaped the realm yet again. The question was whether Jaime could hold it all together, or whether the cracks beneath his feet would finally swallow them all, lion and lamb alike. As the new arrivals dismounted, bowing before him, Jaime forced a nod of welcome. Then he led them into the keep, where Cersei, unbowed despite her recent ordeal, waited to plan their next move. Beyond the city walls, thunderheads gathered, black and ominous. And though the future was hidden in those swirling clouds, Jaime Lannister knew well that the storms to come would test him more than any battle of his youth. He had taken a life, stolen a father from his siblings, and assumed a mantle that had never been intended for him. Now he would have to pay for it one way or another. He would face it sword in hand or gold hand if that was all he had. He was lord of Casterly Rock, kinslayer by his own secret, and the realm had never been closer to shattering. There could be no turning back from the path he had chosen. And though he held the rock, in his heart he wondered if, before the end, the rock might crush him under its endless weight. Still, Jaime Lannister pressed onward. For that is what lions do. The morning sun crawled over the Red Keep's towers, lengthening shadows along the courtyard. A breeze from Blackwater Bay carried the sharp tang of brine and the stench of the city's refuse, a reminder that King's Landing was never fully cleansed of its rot, even in the first hours of light. Jaime Lannister stood in the yard, clad in crimson enameled plate, the golden lion of House Lannister emblazoned on his surcoat. He looked upon the ranks of riders that had arrived from the west, his men. Each bore the lion's sigil on their shields, the same crest Jaime had grown up beneath in the halls of Casterly Rock. He tasted something bitter on his tongue, a regret or a question, but he could not name it. Perhaps it was the lingering memory of the father he had destroyed with his own hand. He reminded himself that he had done what he had done out of rage and a lifetime of pent-up fury, but that did not ease the weight he felt day after day. There was no undoing Tywin Lannister's death. The realm had felt the repercussions already. House Lannister was perched in a precarious position. The once fearsome seat of power was tested by the faith militant, by the Tyrells, by every vulture in Westeros. And Jaime himself was new to lordship. Sometimes he felt like a boy stumbling in armor many sizes too big. In the courtyard, the men began to dismount, stamping dust from the road off their boots. Several knights approached Jaime and dipped their heads. He recognized Ser Kennos of Deep Den, a grizzled man whose face was scarred from a skirmish with outlaws years ago, and Ser Forley Prester, once a subdued presence at Casterly Rock's feasts. They gave Jaime a respectful bow. Not so long ago, these men would have saluted him as Ser Jaime, Kingsguard. Now they called him my lord, which still felt like an ill-fitting cloak. But a lord he was, thanks to Cersei's maneuvering and a royal decree that had stripped him of the white cloak in favor of his father's seat. "Welcome to King's Landing," Jaime told them, keeping his voice measured. "You've come at an uneasy time, but your presence will help maintain the peace." Ser Kennos nodded. "We march at your command, my lord. The men are weary from the road but ready for orders." "See that they rest," Jaime said. "I'll have you assigned quarters in the city, near the Mudgate, or within the castle if space allows. Rations will be provided. Keep discipline. The small folk are restless. One outburst could spark a riot." Forley Prester shifted, glancing about. "Understood, my lord. Will we be facing combat soon?" Jaime hesitated. "That depends on the High Sparrow and whether he yields. If the faith militant relinquish their hostages, Margaery Tyrell and Ser Loras, we might avoid bloodshed. But with war, there's no telling. Remain alert." The knights bowed again, and Jaime gestured for a few attendants to guide them and their men to lodging. As they filed away, Jaime felt a certain numbness, the same dull ache he had carried for weeks now. War hovered on the horizon like a thundercloud. The Tyrell host approached from the south, commanded by Mace Tyrell, who demanded his children's release. The faith militant, emboldened by their sudden power, refused to let either Margaery or Loras go without a trial and penance. And Cersei, battered by her own imprisonment and walk of atonement, brimmed with vengeful fury behind closed doors. At times, Jaime thought he could almost feel his father's presence in the corners of the Red Keep, as if Tywin had become some unquiet specter haunting the seat of the very family he had once commanded. Jaime wondered if the ghost had come for him or for them all. He turned away from the courtyard and made for the castle's inner gates, passing through a stone archway. Gold cloaks stood guard, stifling yawns at this early hour. They snapped to attention at Jaime's approach. He acknowledged them with a curt nod. Once inside the keep, he climbed a winding flight of stairs that led toward the royal apartments. He knew Cersei would be awake, if she had slept at all. Since her walk of atonement, she had existed in a state of perpetual tension, pacing her chambers, writing letters with a frantic hand, snapping at attendants who dared so much as fumble a jug of wine. The humiliations she had suffered publicly seethed inside her, festering into a potent determination to punish everyone who had a hand in her disgrace. He arrived at the corridor leading to her solar. 2 Kingsguards stood outside, stoic in their white armor. Jaime cast them a sidelong glance. He no longer wore that same uniform. He was Lord of the Rock, not a sworn brother in the white. He recognized Ser Boros Blunt, who tried to hide the wariness in his eyes. The other was Ser Osmond Kettleblack, leaning a fraction too casually against the wall until he saw Jaime and straightened in a hurry. "Is the Queen Mother awake?" Jaime asked, though he knew the answer. Blunt cleared his throat. "She is, my lord. She's been in there since before dawn." Jaime inclined his head and stepped into the solar. The room smelled of scented wax and stale perfume. Heavy curtains were drawn across the tall windows to dull the bright morning, leaving only the glow of a few candles set atop the table. Cersei stood near those candles, bent over a scrap of parchment, quill in hand. She was dressed in a dark red gown, her hair still short and ragged from the Faith's rough shears, though she tried to disguise it with a net of gold filigree. When she heard Jaime enter, she lifted her eyes, face betraying the remnants of anger and exhaustion. "You're early," she remarked. "Or did you not sleep?" Jaime closed the door behind him. "I rose with the new arrivals. Forces from the Rock came in at dawn. I wanted to be there to greet them." Cersei snorted softly. "And are we one step closer to forcing the Faith to release my son's wife? Or am I to endure more bleeding from the Tyrells?" He approached the table. "We're as close as they allow us to be. The Faith stands unyielding. They demand Margaery's trial. They demand Loras's confession for his indiscretions. Meanwhile, the Tyrell army is nearly upon us. If they see no progress, I suspect they'll try to force the issue." Cersei's lips tightened. "I wouldn't weep if Mace Tyrell decided to assault the September and lost half his men. But it would be a disaster for Tommen's reign. Blood in the streets, city turned against us. But this pious rabble has gone beyond all reason. We feed them, shield them, and they repay us with insolence." He studied her features. The shadows under her eyes spoke of nights spent brooding rather than sleeping. "You can't just let Mace Tyrell rush in. The High Sparrow will label him, and by extension the crown, as tyrants waging war on the Faith. Half the city might rise up. They love their new prophet." She set the quill aside with a clench of her fingers. "Then what do you propose, Jaime? We can't stand idle while they keep Margaery and Loras in that miserable September. Tommen's authority wanes with every day they remain captives. The Tyrells accuse us of orchestrating it, and you know they'll never trust us again if we don't secure their families' release soon." Her bitterness was palpable. Jaime recalled the rage in her voice the day she discovered the Faith had turned on her, too, locking her away. The memory of Cersei's broken expression when she finally stumbled back from that walk, pelted by filth, made something in him tighten. The last shred of sympathy he had for the Faith was gone. "I'm not saying we do nothing," he replied carefully, "but we need a measured show of strength. If the Tyrell army arrives, we can place them around the city, while your champion is prepared for your own trial by combat. That might persuade the Faith to moderate their stance. The High Sparrow claims humility, but he can't ignore an army at his doorstep." Cersei tapped her nails on the table. "Yes, a trial by combat. My champion will see me proven innocent before the gods, and by extension we can degrade the Faith's hold. Then Tommen can pardon Margaery and her brother, letting the Tyrells save face if they'll vow loyalty. If they refuse, we threaten them with force." She paused, exhaling. "It might work, but for that to happen, I must have my trial soon. And the High Sparrow seems in no rush. He's spoken of wanting more confessions from me, the old zealot." She spat the word with utter contempt. Jaime understood the unspoken rest. The High Sparrow still believed Cersei had committed incest. Lancel had spilled enough secrets to sow suspicion that Tommen was not Robert Baratheon's true son. If the High Sparrow dared proclaim that in public, all of House Lannister's power might unravel in a heartbeat. They needed to keep him at bay. He looked away from the tension in Cersei's eyes. We'll push for a swift trial. In the meantime, I'll arrange the Lannister host around the city walls, or near the gates. Mace Tyrell can station his men outside as well, and the two forces will keep each other in check. And if the Tyrells attempt to march in unannounced? Cersei asked, crossing her arms. We block them at the gate. No one enters King's Landing without the Crown's permission. Jaime paused. We can't appear weak, but we can't incite open war either. It's a narrow line to walk. Cersei's mouth twisted. A line father could have walked in his sleep, she muttered. Then she shot Jaime a quick glance, as though to gauge his reaction whenever Tywin's name was mentioned. Even after so many weeks, she had not grown used to her father's absence. Jaime's chest constricted, recalling how that absence was his own doing. He let the moment pass and she changed the subject. Very well, prepare your men. We'll inform Mace Tyrell that we'll meet him outside the city. Treat with him about his children's release. Tommen can remain within the Red Keep, safe behind walls, until we see which way the wind blows. Jaime dipped his head. As you command. I'll see to it. As he turned to go, she called after him, voice tight but edged with vulnerability. Jaime, wait. Do you think we can truly outmaneuver the High Sparrow? She rarely allowed doubt to show, but now it trembled at the edges of her words. He's turned the small folk against us, or at least made them question everything we do. The rumors about Tommen. If that spreads, if the faith proclaims him a bastard. She did not finish, but Jaime heard the fear. We can't allow it, he said firmly. Tommen must remain their anointed king. If the faith tries to declare him illegitimate, we threaten them with the combined might of the West and the Reach. Even the faith needs to keep the realm from total chaos. He paused, letting his voice soften. We'll manage, Cersei, and after your trial by combat proves your innocence, we'll have the upper hand. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, drawing a long breath. Go then. I'll expect updates by midday. He left her solar, the weight of her desperation clinging to him like a damp cloak. In the corridor, the King's Guard parted for him without a word. Jaime. He made his way down through the keep's levels, encountering various servants who stepped aside to let him pass. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, illuminating the city's patchwork rooftops, the murky waters of the Blackwater shimmering beyond. Dust swirled in motes around the castle yard. A war was brewing, whether it came in the form of a siege, a riot, or some cunning maneuver by the High Sparrow, Jaime did not know. But war was in the air. He found Kevan Lannister in one of the antechambers near the Great Hall, going over a stack of parchments with several stewards. Kevan looked up, face weary yet resolute. He had been working tirelessly to handle the administrative chaos left behind by Tywin's death, from shipments of grain to dealing with the Iron Bank's demands for repayment. Kevan gave Jaime a small inclination of his head, dismissing the stewards with a gesture so they could speak privately. How goes it, uncle? Jaime asked, aware he sounded drained. Kevan exhaled. Matters progress, slowly. The Iron Bank's envoys remain unsatisfied. They threaten to rescind loans, invest in one of your father's old rivals if we don't begin repaying soon. I've tried to calm them, but with the city in turmoil, coin is scarce. The Tyrell gold is one source, but if we anger them, they might withhold it. So we teeter on the edge of default. Jaime frowned. And if the Iron Bank withholds its support, we risk more than an empty treasury. They could finance rebels or turncoats, or a Targaryen, if rumors are true that one still lives across the sea. Kevan looked grim. Indeed, a rumor, but the Iron Bank is known to back those they believe can repay debts. If they think we're failing, they'll switch loyalties. They have no love for any crown that cannot keep its ledger balanced. Jaime gritted his teeth. Then we must ensure the realm remains stable enough for them to believe we will pay. Have you heard from Ser Davin at the Rock? Kevan gave a short nod. He writes that Euron Greyjoy's raiders have grown bolder. They harass our western coasts, Case in particular. Nothing so large as a full-scale invasion, but enough to damage morale. We've had to station some of our best ships in Lannisport just to keep him at bay. This also strains our resources. If we keep men in the west to defend our shores, we have fewer to spare here." Jaime recognized the pattern. Too many threats, not enough men or gold to quell them all. "We'll have to make do. For now, I want the majority of my Lannister forces here in King's Landing or just outside it. At least the ones who can be spared from the coasts. Mace Tyrell's host draws near, and I'd rather not have him think we're weak. The Faith must see that if they overreach, we'll respond with steel." Kevin pressed his lips together thoughtfully. "A dangerous gambit, but I see no other course. Do you have a plan to resolve the standoff with the Faith?" Jaime recounted his conversation with Cersei. The plan to arrange a meeting with Mace Tyrell outside the city, the hope that Cersei's trial by combat would come soon and reaffirm her as innocent in the eyes of the gods. Once that's settled, we leverage the Queen Mother's innocence to demand Margaery's release. If the Faith refuses, we march. The Tyrells will join us in that, I assume. They want their children freed more than anything. Kevin nodded. "It might work, though I worry the Faith will see such a trial by combat as just another charade. They believe themselves anointed by the gods to punish sin, Lannister or Tyrell or otherwise. They won't care once we crush them," Jaime said quietly, though he felt no relish in the idea of slaughtering Septons and Sparrows. "I've had enough of pious condemnation. If the High Sparrow wants a war, we'll give it to him." Kevin looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read the deeper turmoil that lurked behind Jaime's words. But he only said, "Then let us hope the Faith has some sense left." He paused. "And that these rumors about you and Tywin's death remain buried. I've heard no new chatter, but I don't trust silence. It can hide storms." Jaime didn't reply. A sense of dread pulled at him. The memory of that moment in the hidden corridor beneath the Red Keep, the flickering torch, Tywin's eyes wide with disbelief. He willed it away. Do whatever's necessary to keep those rumors from the High Sparrow's attention. Pay off whomever we must pay, or silence them otherwise. Kevin's face hardened, but he inclined his head. "I'll see to it." They parted, and Jaime made his way through the keep, giving orders for his men to position themselves at the city's gates. The day passed in a blur of instructions, consultations with lesser lords, watchful eyes cast upon the city streets. The Faith militant prowled openly, men in rough-spun robes bearing cudgels, or in some cases armed with spears bearing the seven-pointed star. Tension crackled in every alley. Come dusk, Jaime found himself in the Red Keep's hall where the small council had convened. The group was as fractious as ever. Cersei's seat was empty. She chose not to attend, leaving Jaime to stand in for House Lannister, with Pycelle, Qyburn, Mace Tyrell, just arrived in the city that afternoon under heavy escort, Olenna Tyrell, and a few lesser functionaries in attendance. Tommen was nowhere to be seen. These days, the Boy King spent most hours closeted with a rotating cast of advisors, or simply behind locked doors in fear. Mace Tyrell was pacing, red-faced. Olenna sat in a high-backed chair, sharp-eyed, her lips drawn into a line that suggested she was bored by everyone's stupidity. Pycelle dozed in another chair, occasionally jerking awake to mutter something about how in his day, the king would never have allowed such disrespect. Qyburn stood off to one side, expression mild, fingers laced together inside voluminous sleeves. Jaime announced that he would speak on behalf of the Queen Mother. Mace Tyrell turned on him with a blustering shout, demanding that Loras and Margaery be released at once. Olenna tapped her cane pointedly and said, "Let the poor man speak, Mace, or you'll talk yourself into a heart attack." Mace opened his mouth again but yielded, stepping back, though fury practically radiated off him. Jaime faced them. "Lord Tyrell, Lady Olenna, we share your concern for Margaery and Loras. They are vital members of the royal family and of the court. However, the Faith insists on trying them for alleged crimes. As you know, Queen Cersei herself was confined until recently." Mace snorted. "Confined, yes. Yet your sister stands free while mine remain locked away. Are we to believe she alone merited release? It stinks of favoritism." Jaime kept his voice level. Cersei was released after her walk of atonement and partial confession of certain charges. The Faith still intends to try her on the accusation of incest. She has requested a trial by combat. It is to be scheduled soon. Olenna's gaze flicked around the room, assessing. And in the meantime, we're to let Margaery waste away? My granddaughter is a queen. If the Faith can do this to her, they can do it to anyone. It undermines the very authority of the crown. What good is your boy king on that wretched throne if fanatics can seize royalty at will? We agree, Jaime said, swallowing a pang of bitterness at Tommen's impotence. That's why we propose a united front. The Lannister host is gathering outside the city walls. We invite you to station your men near them. We make our demands clear to the High Sparrow. Margaery and Loras must be released, or at the very least allowed bail at the Red Keep. The same courtesy extended to the Queen Mother must apply to them. If the Faith refuses, we move in as one. Mace Tyrell's eyes gleamed with the idea of martial glory. Yes, that's more like it. We'll storm the September if we must. Break their walls if they try to keep us out. Olenna's stare was cool. Breaking walls is costly, dear, and messy. But if it comes to that, the Faith will learn that the Reach has not forgotten how to wage war. She tapped her cane. I do wonder if your sister encourages this approach as well, or is this you're doing alone? Jaime made a slight inclination of his head. Queen Cersei supports it. She cannot be seen publicly as contravening the Faith's authority, but privately, she agrees we cannot let Margaery remain imprisoned indefinitely. We will stand with you, House Tyrell and House Lannister, united in protecting the king's immediate family. Mace Tyrell huffed, but Olenna gave a sharp nod. Very well. I'll not see my granddaughter defiled by these bigots. We'll gather our men outside the city, as you say. Then we demand an audience with the High Sparrow. If he refuses to meet or to release them, we act. Agreed, Jaime said. I suggest we choose a day soon, so there is no further delay. Tomorrow, Mace declared, brimming with impatience. I want my children safe and quickly. I brought a significant force, enough to send those sparrows scattering. The longer we wait, the bolder they grow. Jaime thought for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Tomorrow at midday, we'll present ourselves at the Great September with both our forces in attendance. We'll request Margaery's and Loras's immediate release, and we shall see how the Faith responds. Olenna's lips curled in a faint smile, though it held little warmth. Let them respond foolishly. They'll find the Tyrell rose has thorns. Jaime ended the session, ignoring Pycelle's half-hearted attempt to interject some caution. The old Grand Maester simply sank back into his seat, blinking. Qyburn offered a thin smile, though he said little. Outside the council chamber, Jaime caught him by the sleeve. The man's face was perpetually calm, almost amiable, yet Jaime knew the sort of experiments Qyburn conducted in the darkness of his laboratories. How fares Cersei's champion? Jaime asked. He disliked the entire notion of a reanimated monstrosity, but Cersei had put her faith in Qyburn's creation. Qyburn gave a slight bow. Very well, my lord. He is prepared to fight at a moment's notice, silent and unyielding. The Faith's champion, whomever they choose, will stand no chance. Jaime suppressed a shudder. He had seen the hulking figure once, an unnaturally tall knight in dark armor that concealed his face entirely. The mere sight of him filled Jaime with disquiet, as though looking upon a dead man who refused the grave. Yet if Cersei counted on that creature to secure her trial by combat victory, so be it. Then be ready, Jaime said. We'll press the High Sparrow to schedule the trial soon. Qyburn inclined his head, walked away with a quiet grace that never failed to unnerve Jaime. Left alone in the corridor, Jaime rubbed his temple. Tomorrow, House Lannister and House Tyrell would stand united before the Great September. This was their chance to free Margaery and Loras without bloodshed. Or it might lead to open conflict, a riot if the small folk turned violent. The Faith might resist, call on its faithful from the slums. Another war in the streets, reminiscent of the worst days of the recent wars, seemed possible. But there was no alternative. The city could not endure indefinite tyranny from the High Sparrow. The crown had to reassert itself. One way or another. Nightfall found Jaime in his chambers, removing his armor piece by piece, setting the gold and crimson surcoat aside. He washed his face at a basin, watching his reflection in the mirror, short-haired, jaw set, the stump of his right wrist ending in a gold hand that glinted in the candlelight. He remembered once being proud, physically unstoppable. Now so much had changed. Still, he had become something else, Lord of Casterly Rock. A role he had never truly desired but was forced into by the ghosts of his own actions. A knock came at the door. Jaime turned, half expecting Kevin or a messenger. Instead, when he opened it, he found Bronn standing there, wearing the smirk that always hovered on his lips. The Sellsword-turned-knight gave a mocking half-bow. "My lord," he said in a tone that mixed respect and ribbing. "I heard you needed some extra muscle tomorrow?" Jaime arched an eyebrow. "Word travels fast. Yes, I might. The Tyrells are forming up outside the city in the morning. We'll confront the faith. Could be dangerous." Bronn shrugged. "Danger pays well if you've coin. Not that I'm just after gold. But a man's got to eat, and drink, and amuse himself with the local wenches." "Of course," Jaime said dryly. "You'll have command of a small detachment of men from the Rock. I want you on the left flank, near the steps leading to the September side entrance. If there's trouble, keep them from flanking us." Bronn nodded. "Sounds like a jolly good time. Any chance we'll get to carve up those fanatics?" Jaime grimaced. "Only if they force our hand. The last thing we need is to turn a negotiation into a massacre." Bronn snorted. "They might do that themselves. Fanatics always do something stupid." "Well, I'll be ready. Any other instructions, my lord? Or should I bring some whores to greet the High Sparrow's lot?" "Don't be an idiot," Jaime said, though faint amusement crept into his tone. "Just be prepared. We move at midday." Bronn departed, humming an off-key tune, evidently pleased at the prospect of gold or glory. Jaime leaned against the doorframe once he was gone, letting the weight of what waited tomorrow wash over him. In his younger days, the notion of a fight might have stirred excitement. Now, he only felt a dull sense of necessity. He had no illusions that a few swords would solve the deeper rot afflicting the realm. The faith's sudden power, the Tyrell tensions, the burdensome debts, the unrest in the West. It all stemmed from Tywin's absence, from the vacuum he left, and from the simple, damning truth that Jaime was the kinslayer who had caused it. He extinguished his candles and climbed into bed, but sleep eluded him for a long while. Instead, he lay in the dark, hearing faint laughter from the corridors beyond, the shuffle of boots, the occasional distant clang of a guard's spear. He remembered the day he had first drawn a steel blade under his father's gaze, how Tywin had judged him with icy precision, offering no praise even when Jaime's skill was plain. Now that father lay entombed beneath Casterly Rock, and Jaime was left to pick up the pieces of a fractured house. At last, exhaustion claimed him, and he sank into restless dreams where the sept bells tolled incessantly, mocking him with their clang. Dawn arrived, watery gray light creeping through the shutters. Jaime rose at once, dressed in armor more suited for battle than ceremony. A steel breastplate with gilded edges, pauldrons shaped like lions' heads, and greaves that caught the morning sun. He strapped on his sword belt, the same sword that had ended Tywin's life, though none knew it but him. The metal felt heavier than usual. Outside in the Red Keep's courtyard, the Lannister men were assembled. Foot soldiers in half-plate, archers with quivers slung across their backs, knights astride their mounts. Golden banners snapped in the breeze. Cersei watched from a balcony. Tommen was not present. He had been told to remain within the keep for his own protection. Kevin stood near Jaime, wearing his own armor, more subdued but still bearing the Lannister lion on the breast. Ser Meryn Trant, Ser Boros Blunt, and Ser Osmond Kettleblack, the three Kingsguard who remained in the city, accompanied them as well, though their loyalties were less about defending the Boy King and more about obeying Cersei. Jaime looked them over, remembering once that he had been their Lord Commander. Now they only nodded curtly in his direction. They moved out at a measured pace, winding through the streets that led from the Red Keep toward the Great September of Baelor on Visonyas Hill. The city's small folk turned out to watch, pressed against doorways, muttering under their breath. Fear and curiosity mingled in their expressions. They had seen enough war. Some spat at the sight of the gold lions, while others bowed. A throng of the faith's followers stood in small clusters, eyes narrowed, some openly carrying clubs or crude flails. Jaime's men stayed alert, hands on sword hilts, but no violence erupted on the slow procession toward the hill. At the edge of the large square that fronted the Great September, they met Mace Tyrell's host. Thousands of men in the green and gold of Highgarden lined the streets, forming a thick column that parted as Jaime's contingent approached. Mace Tyrell himself rode forward, clad in burnished armor shaped to suggest the petals of a rose. At his side was Randyll Tarly, whose grim countenance showed only a flicker of acknowledgement for Jaime. Olenna was not present. Likely she had chosen to remain in the safety of her quarters, letting the men do the posturing, as she might call it. "Well met, Lord Lannister," Mace said, somewhat stiffly. "We're all assembled. Are we prepared to give these holy men a chance to release my children without bloodshed?" Jaime inclined his head. "That is the plan, Lord Tyrell. Let us proceed." The sept loomed ahead, a massive structure of marble and domes, its doors carved with the faces of the Seven. Scores of poor fellows and warriors' sons guarded the steps. Their leader, the High Sparrow, was nowhere in sight, but the presence of so many faith militant made the tension crackle. Jaime's men spread out, forming a line near the foot of the wide steps, the Tyrell soldiers flanking them. A hush fell over the onlookers in the square. Jaime rode forward a few paces, Kevin at his side, with Mace and Tarly mirroring them. A man in the simple robes of the faith stepped down from the sept's doors. He looked at the assembled force as though disappointed, though fear flitted across his features. Finally, his eyes landed on Jaime. "My lord, have you come to pay respects to the Seven, or do you intend to defile these holy grounds with violence?" Jaime spoke loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We come to demand the release of Queen Marjorie and Ser Loras Tyrell, held by your order. We also demand a formal date for Queen Cersei's trial by combat. The king's family will not be held hostage by the faith any longer." Mace Tyrell, chest puffed up, added, "Release them now, and we'll not shed blood. If you refuse, we'll storm the September. You'll find we're not so forgiving as we once were." Tarly remained grimly silent, but his men bristled with readiness. The robed man held his staff more tightly. "These charges are serious. Her Grace stands accused of perjury and adultery. Her brother is accused of unnatural acts. The High Sparrow insists that they must confess and do penance. They will answer the charges before the crown, not in your cells," Jaime said, voice carrying. "Should they be found guilty by a fair process, let the king decide punishment. That is how the realm has functioned for centuries." A murmur swept through the faith's ranks. Some spat upon the ground, muttering curses about sin. The robed man hesitated. "Wait here," he finally said. "I will fetch the High Sparrow." He turned and hurried up the steps. The faith militant parted to let him pass. Moments stretched like drawn bowstrings. The gathered soldiers shifted, swords clinking. Jaime took stock of the great square. Windows overhead in the surrounding buildings, some shuttered, some with onlookers peering out. The city seemed to hold its breath. At last, the High Sparrow himself appeared atop the steps, flanked by warriors' sons in mail and shining star emblems. He was barefoot, clad in a tattered robe. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a fervor that could cow lesser men. Jaime remembered him from previous confrontations, the unwavering conviction that had cast Cersei into her own cell once upon a time. The High Sparrow raised his hands. "Lords of the realm, you come armed to the teeth, demanding the release of those who transgressed the laws of gods and men. This is no place for steel. This is the House of the Seven." Mace Tyrell's patience snapped. "Where's my daughter? Bring her out at once, or by the Seven." I'll have my men tear this place apart stone by stone." The faith militant bristled, but the High Sparrow did not move. His gaze flicked between Mace and Jaime. "I see no humility here, only pride and wrath. Perhaps that is why the realm bleeds from war to war. There is no love of the gods in your hearts, only fear for your power." He paused, letting the words echo. "Nevertheless, I am a merciful servant of the Seven. Queen Marjorie has sworn to the truth of her innocence, but the inquest is not yet complete. As for Ser Loras, he has confessed to certain sins that must be atoned for. We cannot simply release him, not when his soul is at stake." Randyll Tarly's face reddened. "My lord," he spat at the High Sparrow. "His soul is none of your concern. He is a noble son of House Tyrell. If he has broken the law, he will face a proper trial by the king's judges." The High Sparrow's brow knit in mild disapproval. "The king's justice is also the god's justice, is it not? Why should they conflict?" Jaime's jaw tightened. "Release Marjorie and Loras to the crown's custody, or we will end this farce by force. You have until the count of 10. He had no desire to bring swords into a holy place, but they were left no choice if the faith refused. Mace Tyrell looked relieved at Jaime's forceful stance. The High Sparrow closed his eyes briefly, as though offering a silent prayer. Jaime drew a breath, preparing to issue the final ultimatum. But before he could speak, the doors of the sept opened wider. A half-dozen faith militant emerged, escorting two figures in drab gray robes. Marjorie Tyrell's face was pale and drawn, eyes guarded. Ser Loras followed, looking thinner, with hollow cheeks and a haunted expression. At the sight of them, a surge of emotion crossed Mace Tyrell's features. Marjorie stumbled on the top step, then straightened, forcing a regal bearing. One of the warrior's sons nudged her, and she bit her lip, ignoring him. The High Sparrow gestured. "Here is your queen. She has yet to complete her confession, but I will allow her to walk free if she returns for the final hearing in 3 days. Should she fail to appear, the faith's condemnation shall be known across the realm." Mace exhaled, relief warring with anger. "We accept," he said quickly, motioning for men to come forward and guide Marjorie down the steps. Loras, however, was not released. The High Sparrow placed a hand on the young knight's shoulder. "Ser Loras remains in our care. He has confessed to grievous sins of the flesh and has chosen a life of penance. We cannot let him leave until his soul is purified." Loras's vacant stare suggested a broken spirit, though at mention of remaining in custody, his eyes flickered with a trace of fear. Mace Tyrell bristled, spittle flying from his lips. "No, my son comes as well. You won't keep him." Jaime heard the crowd murmur. The faith militant raised their weapons. Jaime's men likewise braced for the possibility of violence. Jaime spoke through clenched teeth. "We demanded them both. You cannot simply release one and keep the other prisoner." The High Sparrow gazed at him with what might have been pity. "Ser Loras has made a different choice. He confessed his sins. He must find salvation through the path of humility. Queen Marjorie denies her guilt, so she remains in your care while we conduct further inquiries. We do what is best for their souls, my lord, not for your pride." Jaime lifted a hand to keep Mace from shouting further. He considered the implications. If the faith refused to yield Loras, they were effectively having the tension but also offering partial compliance. Attacking now, with Marjorie half-freed, might seem monstrous in the eyes of the small folk. They would see an armed force assaulting men of the cloth, ignoring the gesture of the faith. But if they walked away, they left Loras in captivity, further fueling the Tyrell's resentment. Jaime's instincts told him that any rash move could incite a bloodbath. The squares around the September were filled with the faith's loyal supporters, and there was no guarantee a frontal assault would go smoothly. He glanced at Mace Tyrell, who silently pleaded with him to do something. Randyll Tarly's knuckles were white on his sword hilt, itching for a fight. Jaime forced himself to be pragmatic. "We must speak with Queen Marjorie," he said to the High Sparrow. "Then we will decide our next step." He gestured for Marjorie to be brought forward. She descended the steps, flanked by 2 Tyrell knights who took her arm gently. Her face showed relief at seeing them, but also weariness. "You want to speak here?" the High Sparrow asked, raising an eyebrow. "No," Jaime said. "We'll take her back to the Red Keep, see to her well-being. Then we'll return tomorrow to discuss Ser Loras's release. If you refuse, we will not hesitate to use force." The High Sparrow held Jaime's gaze. Violence in the name of saving a man from his chosen path. A sin compounding a sin, my lord. But we shall pray for guidance. He half-turned, dismissing them by looking to his followers. They parted to let Marjorie pass, but Loras was pulled back inside, eyes full of a despair that cut Jaime to the core. Despite Loras's arrogance in earlier days, he did not deserve this captivity. Mace Tyrell rode forward, calling out to the High Sparrow, "We will return for him, you hear me?" The High Sparrow did not respond, only disappeared into the shadows of the sept. Tension lingered in the air. Slowly, the armies began to disperse. Lannister men forming ranks to escort Marjorie, Tyrell banners swirling as they moved aside, uncertain whether to force a confrontation. Eventually, the entire party retreated from the Great September, heading back toward the Red Keep in a subdued procession. Marjorie clung to one of her guards, her posture rigid, face drawn. Jaime rode near her, offering a quiet, "We're glad you're free, your grace," felt hollow knowing Loras was still a prisoner. She gave him a careful look. "I'm not free. I'm only out of that cell. That's not the same thing." Her voice was hoarse, her eyes flicking over the array of men. "Have you found proof of my innocence yet? I told them repeatedly I did nothing wrong, but they only demanded confessions. Forced me to kneel in prayer for hours on end. Starved me of sleep." She trailed off, trembling. Her ordeal was clear in her eyes. "We'll put an end to it," Jaime promised, though he was not sure how. "Tomorrow we confront them about Loras, demand his release. One way or another, we'll see you both reunited." Marjorie lowered her lashes, mouth pressed into a tight line. She didn't voice her doubts, but Jaime suspected she found it hard to trust anyone after being cast into that cell. When they reached the Red Keep, she was immediately taken to her quarters, while healers and maids fluttered around her. Mace Tyrell and Randall Tarly joined, leaving Jaime in the courtyard again with his own thoughts. Cersei emerged from an archway soon after, wearing a gown of burgundy and a stiff expression. She nodded curtly at Jaime, then looked about as though expecting to see Loras with the returning party. Her mouth twisted when she realized only Marjorie had come back. "They kept him," Jaime exhaled. "Yes, they say he confessed to everything, embraced a life of penance. The High Sparrow refused to let him go." "How inconvenient," she said, voice laced with mock sympathy. "Well, that splits the Tyrell's fervor. Marjorie is out. Loras remains inside. Clever of the faith." She glanced sideways at Jaime. "And what do we do now? Attack at once?" "They're not giving us much choice," Jaime admitted. "But if we attack now, it looks like we're punishing them even after they granted a partial concession. The city might turn on us. Still, we can't let them keep Loras forever." Cersei's eyes flicked toward the tower where Marjorie was taken. Her presence in the keep might keep the Tyrells calm for a moment, at least until they realize how thoroughly the faith has broken Loras. Her expression hardened. "If she testifies at my trial, let's hope she doesn't say anything unpleasant." Jaime frowned. "Why would Marjorie testify against you? She's no friend of yours. But at the moment, she has bigger concerns." Cersei shrugged. "I don't trust her, or any Tyrell. They might cut a deal with the faith for all we know if it helps them. But never mind that. We must push for my trial soon, so once I'm absolved by combat, we have a stronger hand to play. Meanwhile, Marjorie can recover. The Tyrells get a small victory, but Loras's captivity will keep them on edge. Let them blame the faith more than us." Jaime recognized the cunning in her plan. Her absolution by trial by combat would presumably place her above the faith's condemnation, letting her stand proud once more as the Queen Mother. If Marjorie was still in questionable standing, it might drive a wedge between her and the small council. The Faith might want to delay your trial to keep leverage over you, he pointed out. Cersei gave a cold smile. Qyburn is working on it. The High Sparrow can't delay forever. If he does, we show our armies outside the September again. Eventually, they must permit the trial to avoid open war, or so we'll claim. Jaime rubbed his jaw. And if they call your champion an abomination, refuse the trial on grounds that the champion is not truly living, they might sense something unnatural about him. Cersei's nostrils flared slightly. They'll have to prove such accusations, which they cannot. He's a knight, anointed. That's enough for the law. Besides, the Faith's own records allow trial by combat as a legitimate means to prove innocence. The High Sparrow would only discredit himself by denying it. Her eyes flashed. We must show no doubt, no weakness. The Faith feeds on weakness. He wanted to remind her that Tywin had used cunning more than brute force, but the words died in his throat. Bringing up their father was too raw a subject, a reminder of the irreversible step Jaime had taken. Instead, he said, "Very well. I'll speak with Qyburn. We'll push them. We need to watch the city carefully. If the Faith's fanatics rise up, it won't be a small riot. It'll be the entire underclass surging through the streets." Her mouth thinned. "Let them surge. We have steel. That's more than they can say." Yet he detected a flicker of unease in her expression. Even Cersei understood how quickly a mob could turn lethal. They parted ways, Jaime to see about remustering the men, Cersei presumably to speak with Marjorie or to greet Mace Tyrell. Throughout the rest of the day, tension coiled in the corridors of the Red Keep. Every whisper echoed with talk of the Faith, of Loras's captivity, of Cersei's impending trial. Jaime oversaw the Lannister soldiers camp outside the gates, ensuring they had strong defensive lines. Mace Tyrell's men pitched their pavilions in the fields near the city, creating two distinct clusters of armed might that ringed King's Landing like great jaws waiting to snap. Night fell without bloodshed, and Jaime tried to rest, but again he found no true peace. The hours seemed to warp, haunted by memories of his father, by visions of Loras chained in a cell, by the monstrous champion Qyburn had conjured. He woke from a dream in which Tywin's eyes stared at him from beneath the Sept's altar, mouthing silent accusations. Cold sweat slicked his brow. Dawn was creeping over the horizon. Another day of careful maneuvering lay ahead, and the realm felt more precarious than ever. In the new day's early hours, he met with Kevin in a small study within the Red Keep. Kevin poured them weak wine, foreheads furrowed with the burdens of their house. The older man had clearly not slept well either, deep lines etched in his face. "The city is uneasy," Kevin reported. "The small folk see the Tyrell banners outside the walls and wonder if war is upon them. Prices for bread and fish rise by the hour, as merchants fear disruptions. The gold cloaks are on edge, especially with the Faith militant patrolling certain districts." Jaime sat with the wine cradled in his left hand, his golden right hand resting on the table. "We can't let the city starve. We need to keep trade flowing. The Tyrells supply a good deal of grain from their harvest. Let them know we're counting on them to keep the city fed. If they withdraw that supply, the people might revolt." Kevin nodded. "I've already spoken to Mace Tyrell. He assures me they will continue shipments, as long as we're making progress in freeing Loras. But if we stall, I fear he might cut us off. And if that happens," Jaime said, "the Iron Bank will sense further weakness. The cycle continues." He rubbed his temple. "We must find a way to break this. Cersei's trial might be the key. Once she's absolved, we can declare the Faith's captivity of Loras unlawful and move in with the Tyrell's blessing, assuming Mace cooperates." Kevin considered this. It could work, but the question remains. Will the Faith let her proceed with the trial swiftly, or will they conjure more delays? The High Sparrow thrives on moral leverage. He might claim he needs more time for spiritual reflection. Jaime's jaw set. "In that case, we push him. We gather outside the September again. Threaten to tear it down stone by stone if he won't name a date. So be it. Enough of this caution." Kevin frowned, though not in disagreement. Have a care, nephew. The faith has many followers. A single spark could set King's Landing aflame. That spark might be inevitable, Jaime said bluntly. Better it come on our terms than his. So the day progressed in anxious waiting. Marjorie, recovering from her ordeal, remained in her quarters, visited by her grandmother and by Cersei, though what was said behind closed doors Jaime could only guess. Rumors circulated that Marjorie had been forced to recite humiliating confessions but refused to sign any document. Meanwhile, the Tyrell soldiers grew restless outside the city. Several minor scuffles broke out between faith militant and roving knights who had gone too far from camp. Jaime had to send mediators to quell it. By evening, Jaime received word from Qyburn that the High Sparrow was finally ready to speak about scheduling Cersei's trial by combat. The location would be the courtyard in front of the Great September, 3 days hence. Jaime felt a cautious surge of relief. If the trial occurred, and the champion proved victorious, Cersei would walk free of the faith's condemnation. Then, at least in theory, they could demand the immediate release of Loras, backed by the unstoppable champion that had bested the faith's chosen fighter. He went to deliver the news to Cersei, finding her in her solar with candles lit despite the early dusk. She stood by the window, gazing out at the blackening sky over the city. When he entered, she turned, arms folded. "So it's decided?" she asked, her voice subdued but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "Yes," Jaime said. 3 days from now, in front of the September." A wry curl touched her mouth. "Good. Let the small folk see me triumph there, on the very steps where they spat at me. When my champion crushes theirs, all will know the gods have declared me innocent." Jaime suppressed a shiver. He remembered the spectacle of a trial by combat, how quickly it could turn from a moment of bravado to a scene of blood and horror. But if Qyburn's creation was truly unstoppable, "We'll be ready," he said simply. She nodded, then glanced away. "Once I have my victory, the faith will lose their hold over the crown. Then we shall force them to free Loras. That might placate the Tyrells for a time." He caught the edge in her tone. "And Marjorie?" Cersei's face was unreadable. "She claims innocence. Let the people see. If we bring her to trial as well, it might cause a backlash from the Tyrells. Perhaps it's better if she's quietly exonerated by the king's command, once the faith is humbled. In any case, she's no threat to me right now. Her beauty has faded after her time in that cell, and she's learned humility. Maybe she'll make a decent queen for Tommen, docile and pliable." Jaime doubted that Marjorie Tyrell would remain docile for long, but he did not press the point. He stepped closer, lowered his voice. "Cersei, be cautious. I don't trust the High Sparrow not to pull some trick before the trial. Guard yourself. Don't move alone in the keep." She let out a derisive snort. "I've my champion. I'm not afraid of dusty septons in rags." "It's not just them I'm concerned about," he said, thinking of backdoor alliances or possible betrayals from other corners. "The city swarms with those who might hate you, and with talk of Tommen's parentage circulating, we should keep watch for cunning foes." Her lips thinned. "Let them come. I'll see them all burn if they try to harm me or Tommen." She turned back to the window, a shadow stretching across her face. Jaime moved away, feeling her tension like a palpable force. He left the solar, treading corridors lit by torches that sputtered in the draft. The day was almost at its end, yet the city felt alive with unspoken threats. 2 nights later, on the eve of the trial, King's Landing brooded under storm clouds. Rain spattered the walls of the Red Keep, hissing against torch flames. Jaime walked the ramparts, gazing out at the camps. The Tyrell pavilions glimmered with lanterns, the Lannister lines likewise. Neither force had moved from its position, both poised to respond if the faith tried anything reckless. So far, the faith militant had remained behind the walls of the Sept, aside from small patrols. The city's small folk took shelter from the downpour, leaving the streets eerily empty. Jaime paused at a crenellation, letting the raindrops streak down his armor. He was about to turn back when a voice spoke behind him. "A fine night for brooding, my lord." It seems we share a taste for gloom and wet stone. It was Bronn, clad in a hooded cloak. He carried a wineskin in one hand. Jaime managed a thin smile. Checking on the men? Aye, though they're all snug in their tents. I prefer a bit of fresh air. Bronn took a swig from the skin. Want some? It's not the best vintage, but it warms the throat. Jaime shook his head. He wasn't in the mood for cheap wine. Bronn leaned on the parapet, eyes scanning the dark city. Big day tomorrow, eh? All the realm has heard how the Queen Mother will prove her innocence by the sword of that monstrous knight. He glanced sideways. You think he's truly unstoppable? Jaime considered how to answer. He might be. Qyburn is a man of unique talents. If he says the champion cannot be beaten, then perhaps he cannot. Bronn made a non-committal sound. Well, I've seen large men cut down before. Size and strength help, but the slightest miscalculation poison. A blade between the plates. He shrugged. But if you're betting on him, I suppose that's the best wager in King's Landing. They stood in silence for a time, listening to the rain patter. At length, Bronn lowered his voice. Word in the camps is that the High Sparrow might have a trick up his sleeve. Some speak of new evidence, some half-mad rumor. Something out Tywin Lannister's real killer. Jaime's heart hammered. What have they heard? Bronn shrugged, swigging more wine. Rumors. That it wasn't Tyrion. That maybe your father was found in a place Tyrion couldn't have reached. That certain men saw you on the night of the murder, near the secret corridors. It's all whispered nonsense so far, but you know how whores and soldiers gossip. Jaime forced his face to remain stony. Tyrion was convicted. That's the official verdict. He threatened father in the throne room, had motive, and he's gone, vanished. That's enough for most people. Sure, Bronn said, but his tone carried doubt. Just be aware. If the High Sparrow wants to fling mud, he might fling that, especially if it can weaken you, or put a wedge between you and the Tyrells, or cast suspicion on Tommen's legitimacy. He might do it to tarnish your support for the Queen Mother. Jaime's pulse throbbed in his temples. Let him try. Without proof, it's just lies. Even as he said it, he pictured the Faith dragging out some guard who had glimpsed Jaime in that corridor, or some scrap of evidence overlooked. The ramifications would be catastrophic. Kinslayer, Oathbreaker, the realm would recoil. The Tyrells might withdraw their support. The Faith would claim the moral high ground, condemning House Lannister as a nest of murderers and deceivers. Bronn nodded and changed the subject with a casual shrug, speaking of a dice game among the men. But Jaime barely heard him. His mind churned. If the High Sparrow tried to use that rumor to poison the trial, he would have to be silenced. Or else a wave of destruction would follow. Jaime stared out at the rainy darkness, wishing he could sink into it and vanish. Eventually, he left Bronn behind, returning to his chambers. The night wore on, thunder muttering in the distance. Sleep was fleeting and uneasy, haunted by swirling dreams of father and fatherless realm. Morning came wet and gray, though the rain had slackened to a faint drizzle. Word spread quickly. The time for Cersei's trial by combat was nigh. Mace Tyrell, Olenna Tyrell, Kevan, Pycelle, and many other lords gathered to witness. Soldiers from the west and the Reach lined the streets, ensuring the Faith's followers could not swarm uncontrollably. A hush of expectation blanketed the city. Jaime donned full ceremonial armor, with red enamel and gilded lion motifs. He strapped on his sword with trembling fingers. Then he mounted a horse in the courtyard, joined by Kevan, Mace Tyrell, Randall Tarly, and a procession of knights. Cersei would travel in a covered litter, escorted by a small contingent of gold cloaks. Qyburn's champion rode behind, clad in ominous dark plate that fully concealed his face, thick and impenetrable. The champion's sheer bulk made the horse underneath him look small. He gave no sign of breath or voice, as if a statue come to life. They set out. The drizzle lent the air a chill that seeped into bone. The roads to the Great September were cleared by the soldiers. On either side of the route stood small folk, huddled under cloaks, straining to see the spectacle. Some shouted curses, calling Cersei names. Others prayed or wept. The faith militants stood in small knots, brandishing their 7-pointed star emblems, but made no move to attack. Jaime's heartbeat thundered as they reached the plaza before the Great September. The wide space was ringed by a circle of armed men, Lannister, Tyrell, and gold cloaks, while the faith militant clustered on the Sept steps. The High Sparrow was there, flanked by a group of Septas and Septons, with a handful of older men who wore austere expressions. A wooden dais had been erected in the center of the plaza, presumably to serve as the makeshift arena for the trial by combat. Torches guttered along its edges, fighting against the lingering gloom of the overcast sky. Cersei's litter halted at the dais. She emerged, dressed simply in dark cloth, no jewels adorning her. The short hair from her imprisonment was covered by a black veil, pinned at her temples. Even so, her posture radiated defiance. Qyburn stood with her, wringing his hands. Kevan and Jaime dismounted, moving to either side of her. Mace Tyrell and Randall Tarly hung back, watchful. The High Sparrow stepped forward, arms raised. "We gather in the sight of the Seven, to judge the guilt or innocence of Cersei of House Lannister, once queen, now mother of the king. She stands accused of fornication, treason, incest. The faith calls upon her to renounce these sins, or prove her innocence by trial by combat. Is she prepared to stake her life upon the gods' judgment?" Cersei's voice rang out, calm yet laced with steel. "I am." The High Sparrow nodded. "Then present your champion." Cersei gestured, and the towering knight in dark plate moved forward, each step ponderous on the dais. He said nothing, offered no salute. The High Sparrow turned. "Here stands the faith's champion." He beckoned, and a figure emerged from behind the Sept's pillars, an older man in chainmail, with a stern brow and a star carved into his breastplate. He carried a long sword and wore a helmet shaped like a dome. Jaime did not recognize him immediately, though from the hush among the faith, he guessed the man was one of their revered warriors' sons, known for both piety and skill. A small group of Septons recited prayers, calling upon the gods to guide the champion whose cause was just. Rain pattered on the dais. The crowd watched in taut silence, scanning for any sign that this was all preordained. Jaime's gaze flicked to the High Sparrow, who watched with unwavering calm. Perhaps the man was truly prepared to see this trial end in blood, trusting that the gods' will would spare the innocent or punish the guilty. Or perhaps he had some cunning plan to sabotage the monstrous knight. The older champion of the faith stepped onto the dais. Both combatants faced each other. One was gaunt but moved with a wiry grace, and he pressed a hand to the star on his chest as though calling upon the stranger to guide him. The other stood like a statue of living granite, a head taller, his armor black as pitch. A hush fell. A Septon gave a final cry. "Let the gods judge!" Steel flashed. The faith's champion lunged, surprisingly quick, aiming a blow at the monstrous knight's midsection. The dark knight blocked with a motion that seemed almost lazy. The swords clanged, echoing across the plaza. The faith's champion danced aside, circling, searching for a gap in the black plate. He lunged again, aiming for the back of the knee. Again, the monstrous knight parried with inhuman speed. Each time, the champion of the faith found steel meeting an impenetrable wall. A ripple of fear passed through the faith's spectators. Jaime felt his own chest tighten. He had once been famed for his swordsmanship. Even with one hand, he could still gauge skill. The faith's champion was skilled indeed, but the Black Knight possessed an otherworldly strength and resilience, absorbing blows with no apparent effect. The champion landed a strike to the Black Knight's side, but the blade merely screeched across the armor, leaving no dent. The older knight's eyes widened in alarm. Then the monstrous knight advanced, swinging a heavy blow that the faith's champion barely deflected. The force nearly drove him to his knees. Another swing came down, smashing his sword aside. The champion staggered. A hush of horror swept the crowd. The Black Knight seized the champion's arm in a grip that made metal groan. The champion gasped, dropping his sword. With a single motion, the Black Knight hoisted him overhead and, in a brutal display of raw power, cast him to the dais. would splintered under the impact. Before the champion could rise, the Black Knight's gauntlet hand closed around his throat. A final, desperate cry escaped the Faith's champion. The Black Knight squeezed, and that cry became a gurgle. Moments later, the champion lay still, eyes staring blankly. The hush was absolute. The Black Knight released the body, rising. No word came from behind his visor. The Septons stared, horrified, as the monstrous knight turned to face Cersei as if awaiting further orders. Cersei stepped forward, face pale but triumphant. "The gods have spoken," she declared. "I am innocent. Let none call me sinner again." She turned her gaze upon the High Sparrow. "You have your verdict." The High Sparrow's face was drawn tight. A flicker of anguish crossed his features, but he inclined his head. "It is done. The trial has ended." A roar went up from the Lannister soldiers, many of whom had gathered to watch. Some of the small folk cheered, others wept, and some cursed. The Tyrell banners fluttered in uncertain satisfaction, for they had no love of the Faith but also no love of Cersei. Still, it was a blow to the Faith's ascendancy. Their champion lay dead, and the Queen Mother stood vindicated in the eyes of the law. Cersei descended from the dais, surrounded by gold cloaks. Jaime moved to her side, quietly relieved. Yet he kept an eye on the High Sparrow. The man seemed composed, though deeply rattled. With one champion dead, how long would it be before the Faith was forced to capitulate regarding Loras Tyrell? Just as Jaime prepared to lead Cersei away, the High Sparrow lifted his voice. "This woman is judged innocent of the charges put forth. Yet the Faith still must protect the realm from abominations and hidden sins. Beware, good people of King's Landing. A victory by the sword does not mean all is pure. Many secrets remain. Let us remain vigilant." There was a note of warning in his words that sent a chill through Jaime. He half expected the High Sparrow to raise the matter of Tywin's death. But the moment passed without open accusation. The Black Knight loomed, silent, as if daring anyone to challenge Cersei's innocence. With the trial concluded, the crowd began to disperse. The Faith militant carried away the dead champion. Soldiers parted, letting Cersei's litter pass. Jaime walked beside her, scanning the onlookers. He noticed Margaery Tyrell in the distance, clad in a dark cloak, her expression inscrutable. Kevan was conferring with Mace Tyrell. The rain had ceased, leaving the air damp. Overhead, clouds began to thin, revealing patches of pale sky. Back within the Red Keep, the tension that had coiled for days finally released in exhalations and congratulatory remarks for Cersei. She accepted them with a brittle smile, as though the whole ordeal had merely tested her patience. Pycelle tottered about, proclaiming the gods merciful to their rightful Queen Mother. Kevan looked relieved, while Mace Tyrell pressed for immediate negotiations on Loras's fate. Randall Tarly demanded that the Faith return Loras by day's end, or face an armed assault. Margaery, newly arrived, stood close by, silent but determined. Cersei, her voice firm with new authority, declared that the Faith must produce Loras at once. "We will brook no delay. The Tyrell host stands ready, and we have proven that the gods do not favor these false zealots above the crown." A messenger was dispatched to the Great September with an ultimatum. Hours crawled by. Jaime waited in the hall with a phalanx of Lannister soldiers, ready to march at the slightest sign of the Faith's refusal. Mace Tyrell loomed nearby, wearing an impatient scowl. Olenna Tyrell arrived mid-afternoon, looking unimpressed by the whole affair, though an undercurrent of worry lined her gaze. Margaery sat in a corner, twisting her hands in her lap, her eyes distant as though recalling the horrors of her cell. Late in the day, a small group of Faith militant arrived at the Red Keep's gates, carrying a litter. At the sight of them, Lannister and Tyrell soldiers bristled, expecting a confrontation. But the Faith militant raised their hands in a gesture of surrender. Slowly, they approached and set the litter down. There lay Loras Tyrell, weak and battered, but alive. One of the warrior's sons spoke in a low voice. "He is free by order of the High Sparrow." He remains sworn to a life of penance, but we release him to his family. The moment Marjorie saw her brother, she rushed forward. He was barely conscious, a bruise darkening one eye, hair shorn close, lips cracked. Marjorie knelt beside him, tears slipping down her cheeks as she clutched his hands. Mace Tyrell and Olenna followed, fury and sorrow wrestling on their faces. Randall Tarly cursed under his breath, seeing the sorry state of the young knight. Jaime heard Cersei's quiet intake of breath. She had no love for the Tyrells, but even she recognized the faith's cruelty in Loras's condition. "He must see the maesters," Marjorie said, voice shaking. Immediately, as attendants carried Loras inside, the warrior's sons who had brought him lingered awkwardly. Jaime, stepping forward, demanded, "Is this your final surrender? No more demands from the faith." Their leader shook his head. "We have done our duty. The Seven watch over the realm. As for further demands, that is for the High Sparrow to speak of. He remains at prayer." With that, they departed, leaving the Red Keep's courtyard under the watchful eyes of gold cloaks. Cersei nodded in satisfaction. "They've yielded to our ultimatum." A grim smile touched her lips. "We've broken their hold. Now they retreat to lick their wounds." Jaime turned to Kevin, who stood by. "Make sure the city knows that the crown has prevailed, that the king's justice has been upheld. We want no more illusions that the faith can imprison whomever they please." Kevin nodded, dispatching messengers to proclaim the good news. Mace Tyrell lingered long enough to express gratitude to Jaime and Cersei, albeit stiffly. Olenna Tyrell merely gave a curt nod, focusing on her grandchildren's well-being. They would likely remain in King's Landing until Loras recovered, or until Marjorie felt assured of her place beside Tommen once more. And so the crisis seemed, for the moment, averted. The Tyrells had what they wanted, Loras and Marjorie safe. Cersei had her victory, publicly proclaimed innocent. Jaime felt a cautious sense of relief, yet he also sensed that the High Sparrow was not truly defeated. The man had a following that would not vanish overnight. And there was the shadow of rumors that might yet arise, about Tywin, about the parentage of Tommen, about all the twisted secrets that plagued House Lannister. That evening, a feast was held in the Red Keep's Great Hall, nominally to celebrate the restoration of peace between crown and faith, but it was a muted affair. The lords and ladies who attended wore strained smiles. Many still cast anxious glances about, as though expecting a fresh calamity. The trial had ended in violence, and Loras's battered form testified to the faith's capacity for cruelty. Nonetheless, wine flowed, minstrels strummed, and the smell of roast duck drifted across the hall. Jaime sat near the head of the table, with Kevin on one side and Bronn on the other. Across the hall, he saw Marjorie seated with her grandmother, the young queen taking only a few nibbles of her food. Her eyes were distant, her shoulders tense. Near them sat King Tommen, who kept glancing at Marjorie with helpless guilt. Tensions lingered, but at least no open swords were drawn. Cersei presided over the gathering, wearing a gown of crimson velvet, hair still short but crowned with a subtle gold diadem that announced her station. She drank more than usual, pressing her lips together whenever someone tried to speak to her. Jaime wondered if she was consumed by the memory of her trial's brutality, or perhaps she was dwelling on the next steps, removing the High Sparrow completely, stamping out the last of the Faith's defiance, or turning her attention to the realm's broader problems, the Iron Bank, the Greyjoy raids, the rumored Targaryen threat. As the night wore on, Jaime felt the swirl of talk around him. Lords from the Westerlands congratulated him on House Lannister's display of power. Tyrell bannermen begrudgingly admitted that Jaime had handled the confrontation with the Faith well. Yet behind every toast, there was an undercurrent of unease. War had been narrowly avoided, but for how long? Eventually, Jaime left the hall, slipping away from the noise and press of bodies. He climbed a staircase to a higher balcony that overlooked the city. The night sky was clear now, the stars shining over the sprawl of rooftops and winding streets. Torches glimmered in alleyways. The air smelled of damp stone. He leaned on the balustrade, letting the night's coolness wash over him. The immediate crisis with the faith was resolved. Cersei was absolved, Marjorie freed, Loras returned. The Tyrells would likely remain allied, for the moment. But other storms brewed. Euron Greyjoy, the North's uncertain loyalties, the Iron Bank's demands. Any one of them could spark fresh chaos. And behind it all, a father's corpse lay entombed in the rock, the truth of his death known only to Jaime. He felt the weight of that secret as keenly as the gold hand at the end of his wrist. He had become Lord of Casterly Rock by an act of unimaginable betrayal, and though the realm might see him as a champion of order, he could never forget the condemnation that burned inside him. Kinslayer. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint strains of distant music from the feast. The realm was quiet for a moment, but Jaime knew it would not last. They had won a battle against the Faith's hold, but the war for the Seven Kingdoms' future was far from over. Forces swirled on all sides. Tyrell ambitions, Targaryen rumors, Ironborn aggression. Sooner or later, the cracks might widen, letting darkness flood in once more. For now, though House Lannister stood, battered but not broken, gold lion banners still waving over the Red Keep and the Rock, Jaime clung to that fragile victory, telling himself it was enough. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new betrayals perhaps, and new demands on the Lord of Casterly Rock. But he would face them. He had no other choice. He had set himself on this path the moment he shoved a sword into Tywin's gut. He would see it through no matter the cost. The night air whispered across his face, carrying the faint echo of a lion's roar, real or imagined. He could not tell. Jaime Lannister stood there a long time, gazing over the city he had helped save from one calamity, pondering the next. And somewhere deep in the recesses of his heart, he wondered if Tywin's ghost still lurked, judging him in silence. So Jaime did not turn away. Let the dead judge. The living realm needed him more. And tomorrow, as always, the sun would rise on a Westeros that demanded another day's worth of cunning, steel, and blood. If House Lannister was to endure, Jaime would be the one to steer it. He lifted his golden hand, letting the moonlight shimmer on its surface, and then he lowered it, steadying himself for the battles yet to come.